Good evening all and welcome. Tonight I present you with a chilling collection of paranormal stories, so get comfortable and let the darkness take control. This is a summation of my paranormal experiences, and they start before I was born. My maternal grandmother also had paranormal experiences and what she called the discernment of spirits. She would go on to tell my mother that she believed I also had the gift, and she believed it was passed down to me through my maternal genetics. I only know of one experience that my maternal grandmother had with the paranormal. My grandmother was a sickly child who was bedridden most of her childhood. She told my mother that there was a time when she was walking home from school in the spring. I've seen the pictures of my grandmother at this age, and I imagine her with her bouncy dark curls and her Catholic schoolgirl uniform, walking slowly with books to her chest. She said that there was a man sitting on the back seat of a vehicle that was parked along the sidewalk. As she approached him, she began to have this awful sinking feeling. She could see him staring her down, and she kept trying to avert her gaze. As she passed him, she glanced up and saw that he was a corpse, with worms crawling through his skin. She broke into a sprint as he got out of the car and began to amble towards her. Fortunately, she made it to a street with a few school companions, and the entity seemed to have disappeared entirely. There have been so many nights I've prayed and thought, why me? And my mind pictures that scared schoolgirl running away from something only she saw, and I have found solace that terror was a feeling that didn't belong solely to me. For quite some time, I was unable to distinguish between someone who actively witnessed the paranormal in full effect versus someone who was experiencing it secondary, simply to being in a haunted location. It became clear to me when the rest of my family ceased to witness the paranormal after we moved out of our old residency, but I continued to be confronted with the unknown. There are many, many times in my life that I've been forced to contend with things that most people only experience once or one of. I've had physical encounters with being touched or touching something else. I've seen full body apparitions and had conversations with disembodied voices. I've seen creatures that we do not observe in our animal kingdom and interacted with people that were not entirely human. These are not, for the most part, things I've sought out, nor have I wished to see. Nothing was ever wishful thinking or an excited mind getting carried away. These were frequently met with eyes closed tight, quiet praying and wishing it would all end. It is the current goal I am pursuing to live a life less haunted. While I can't pinpoint the precise moment I first experienced a paranormal encounter, I can tell you that the first one occurred in our old house. I capitalize this to give you that specific name, our old house. This is the way we refer to it in our immediate family. At our old house, in our old house, the name sort of has a reverence to it, a weight that indicates that the memory behind it is not entirely pleasant. Our old house is a time capsule in which the memories of us, when we were all victims of something we couldn't fight, belong. The house was first built on the block, with the surrounding neighborhood being farmland. When I was small, I would stand on our front steps overlooking the area and try to picture cornfields or wheat instead of houses. I don't recall the exact year it was built, but if it still stood, it would be 140 years old today, or thereabouts. The city eventually tore this and the rest of the neighborhood down as they were relocating a local school. The memories of a childhood spent swimming in our pool, watching ants crawl in and out of the peony bushes, picking lilacs from the trees for Easter, and a concrete graveyard. I imagine there's a faculty parked right where we had these terrifying experiences. The ordeal and trauma no longer resonating as the energy was lost to pavement. My parents were young, barely in their 30s when they purchased this house in 1989. I was their youngest, just approaching my first birthday while they were settling in. While this wasn't the first house they had lived in, this was the first one they weren't just renting. They were owners, and it was a big milestone for them. I understand 30 years ago, being a homeowner was much easier than it is now, but it was still difficult for them. My parents struggled financially the entire time they were there. In retrospect, it felt as if there was an unseen force that forced us to stay there, in a way of financial hardships. I've listened to so many horror stories, watched the paranormal movies, and everyone has always had the same initial comment. Check any story on YouTube, and in the comments someone will ask, why didn't they just move? Well, it is oftentimes absolutely financially impossible. You were stuck in this house, and we were, for 10 years. I try to imagine how my parents felt in those years. Now that I'm closer to the age that they were while we lived there, did they feel overwhelmed, terrified for the children, and how did they cope not being able to rescue us the way parents want to? The first incident happened within the first weeks of moving in, and was recalled to me by my oldest sibling, Mary. Mary was 8 years old, just old enough to have a solid memory, but not old enough to understand everything that was happening at the time. This event clearly presaged the upcoming residency there. It's evening time. Mum is cooking dinner. The two other kids are in their playpens. You're napping. I'm in the old den, looking out the windows at our new backyard. I have a box of Mum and Dad's office-type things. Their filing cabinet is there, paper, phone books, and Mum's old rotary phone, sitting in a box disconnected. I pull it out, flip through the papers, and pretend I'm an office lady, making important phone calls. I remember sitting on the floor, my legs crossed on the brown shag carpet, dialing nonsense numbers just to hear the whir and click the old phone made, until I picked up the phone and someone was saying my name. I don't recall my original feeling, confusion perhaps, or fear, but now when I think of it, I only feel dread. Someone asked me, Mary, what are you doing, Mary? I told them I was playing. They asked me, where are you, Mary? And I said, in the back room. Mary, are you all alone? Yes, I said. Mum came in and interrupted me at this time, I think to get ready for dinner, but I remember hanging the phone back up and putting it away in its box. It never occurred to me that the conversation I had over the phone was impossible. It takes time when you've moved somewhere new to fully understand the sounds your house makes. What seems odd at first may eventually become normal. The creaking a house makes when the heat kicks in, or the way the hot water heater sounds being filled. It's part of the relationship you build with your home, knowing what noises belong entirely to the house, what stair owns what sound, what door hums what tune when you open it. With a house that was so ancient, there were entirely too many sounds to account for in every direction. The house contained a basement, a main level, the upstairs and an unfinished attic. It had a bathroom on each floor, the master bedroom, 3 smaller bedrooms. The main floor had a dining room, a living room, an entry room, which we referred to as the piano room because that's where we put the piano, a massive kitchen and the den. We had a large backyard, side yard, front yard, and an alley down one side. The trees from the neighbor's yard hung over the alleyway, making it dark and shady. The street was nearly cobbled, rough and uneven. If you took the fear away, it was a magical place to have grown up. Smooth wooden floors to slide across, multiple closets and doors to hide behind, flowering trees to dance around. It was white with grey trim and stood tall and steep. It loomed over the entire block, clearly the main character in the story of our neighborhood. Even with the clean, soft home my mother made that smelled of pledge and laundry softener, your heart always sped up when you walked into a dark room. You looked behind when you went up a flight of stairs. A gentle touch from my mother were the many soft lamps she left on everywhere, a habit that I keep to this day. A soft yellow bulb glowing beneath a white lampshade on an end table tucked away in the living room. A nightlight in the outlet by the bathroom sink. the light in the oven range above the stove being turned on, and the gold piano lamp on, illuminating the glossy wood and sheet music beneath. You were never fully engulfed in darkness, but instead you sidestepped the shadows. You kept empty corners within your peripherals. It is not possible to recall or to have ever known every paranormal event that occurred in this overly inhabited domicile. I imagined the ghostly specters wandering the halls when no one was there to see them, continuing their activity, whether or not there was anyone there to witness it. If the house was not demolished, I suspect this would have been the case. Something so deeply saturated with the paranormal does not rinse clean. Some places just exist, with sets and stains. However, I do wish to share with you some of the things I know for certain were paranormal, and we're about to venture them now. There seemed to be a traveling hotspot in the house that you would be unlucky to walk through, or perhaps it was multiple. You'd catch the icy void at the tips of your fingers when you'd walk down the hall, as if someone was walking right past you. Perhaps you pulled the covers up and had a gush of frosty air rush up to you, from where the warmth should have been. Some days you'd have a cold spot stagnant in one location that you could run your hand through over and over, and the next day it wouldn't be there at all. This was not something so merely as a draft. It was not unlike running your hand over a surface and feeling where a cold item had just been lying. The doors you would close would be opened a moment later, or they'd slowly creak their way shut. I had the leftover habit of closing a door and pressing it for a moment to make sure it firmly latches shut. People have commented on how much force I use to close something, but it was a trait I learned when I learned all new things and has never left. There was this idea that someone was right behind you, and you had to shut the door on them, forcing them to open it and walk out after you. The windows would never stay open, even with Mum using a piece of lath to keep them open. They would always slam shut. If you had a large object holding it open, the object would sometimes fall forward and the window would close. The nail on my ring finger on my right hand is permanently disfigured due to a window slamming shut on it when I was very young. Items would go missing and be inexplicably gone. One specific incident I recall happened with 2 toys I had from All Dogs Go to Heaven. It was Anne-Marie and Charlie that I believe I got from Wendy's. I was playing with it in the bedroom that I shared with my sister Sally, and we had our twin beds pushed together with a navy blue floral print comforter on the top of the 2 of them, covering the split. So it appeared to be one bed. Somehow, despite being on top of the blanket, I lost both toys between the beds. My 2 other siblings, Sally and Dennis, helped me pull the beds apart, then each blanket and under the fitted sheet. Then I crawled under the bed. We checked behind the dresser, under the desk, and even into the closet. They had disappeared entirely and were just gone. I was especially hurt by this and felt resentment towards the house because I knew it ate them up. It was the understanding that only children can have of something that exists without explanation. The house ate it up. Sometimes it'd be regurgitated somewhere else, behind a sofa, above a cabinet, but it mostly just ended up gone. Sometimes the house would take an item and turn it into something it wasn't. We've all had experiences where your clothes piled up on your chair, looking like someone slouched down peering at you, until you frantically turn the light on and realize it's a backpack, a hoodie, and your imagination. Sometimes, here though, it just wasn't that simple. There were times that the coats on the rack would be much too tall, as if around a body, and would shuffle and move, making hangers audibly scrape against the wood. You would stare and stare, waiting for it to turn into what it should have been. I know I would usually lose my nerve and leave the area. We had Hasbro, my buddy doll, which if you've ever seen, are large toddler-sized dolls. I loved him and would pretend he was my child, and I would make him food from our plastic kitchen sets. We had an ancient chalkboard where I would teach him and take him to school. Our basement had so many different areas. A small section with the laundry appliances, Dad's bathroom, his workbench, 2 storage areas for holiday decor, and the pool equipment. And the main rooms, the family room with overstuffed furniture, shag carpeting, Mum and Dad's old records, and old-fashioned TV. The kind that was an entire piece of furniture. The other section of the basement had a table to color at, our toy furniture, and all of my many Barbies in the giant dollhouse my dad had made from a massive old dresser for me. In the corner of this first room, we had a box around 4 feet tall made of plywood, with rope handles and an anchor painted on the front. This was full of old stuffed animals, baby dolls and their clothing. It was a big, soft box, and I recall walking down the basement steps to go play, and as I turned the corner, Buddy was just above the box, before falling back into it. At the time, I thought he was trying to get out, but in retrospect, it appears more so as if a tall being was holding him up to view, and then dropped him back to the box. Later that evening, when playing toys in the basement with my other siblings, Mary, Sally, and Dennis, who was the only boy, I quietly told them what I saw. Mum was told, and her idea was to throw the doll away, but I think we all knew that wasn't a solution. All of our light bulbs had a short lifespan, even when brand new. It wasn't really until we moved to the other house that I realized how long bulbs should be lasting. They constantly flickered out and went out, leaving you unexpectedly in the dark at inopportune moments. This was the same for batteries. In the mid-90s, having electronics run off batteries instead of being plugged into an outlet was incredibly innovative and exciting. I'm sure my parents spent a small fortune on batteries for toys, remotes, and boom boxes that rapidly went through batteries. Again, once we moved, I recall us collectively acknowledging how much longer our batteries lasted. The TV remote could have the same batteries in it for a year, instead of just a few weeks. It goes without saying that the spirits absorbed the excess energy from wherever they could, and this was a phenomenon we were unaware of. I don't know what we would have done with that information at the time. The first book I read about ghosts was when I was around 13. I don't recall the name or author, but the premise was the author, who participated in ghost investigations, became attached to a ghost. I think the name of the phantom was Dan. It was a non-fiction account that she shared, and it explained a lot of ghostly phenomena that I had, at the time, never known were common for hauntings. I remember sitting up in bed late at night and hearing someone else describe so many things we went through, just absolutely boggling my brain. I can recall when I first even knew about ghosts. When I was 8 years old, I spent the night at a friend's house for the first time. I had been to her house before, but this was my first real sleepover. When night approached, I began to feel my usual tension, the kind I always had at home. As TVs turned off, windows closed and lights went out, and the house fell into dark silence, I prepared myself. Not only was I nervous in a new place, but I was nervous as to what would happen to their house at nighttime. What might I see or hear? But as the night progressed, and we lay there whispering on the floor under blankets and giggling, my ears didn't pick up any other sounds. There were neither foreign footsteps nor the sound of doors unlatching and creaking open. I kept hyper-focused on the doorway, where she had the door wide open. I remember thinking it was foolish that she didn't close it, and was waiting for something to pass by. But as the minutes crept by, nothing happened at all, and I fell asleep after everyone else did, to the quiet hum of the ceiling fan and the sleeping sounds of other girls. When I returned home, I asked my older sister about this. I remember feeling like I was asking something inappropriate, and we whispered conspiratorially over it. It was a very cliché, look over both shoulders and lean in to speak kind of moment. Mary told me, in a very serious tone, what she had learnt recently. Ghosts. Our house had ghosts. What was a ghost? Well, Casper was a ghost. He wasn't all bad. Was it like termites? Lice? Was it bad? Did other people know? My initial feeling was shame, as if this was our fault somehow, and it was bad. I recalled my paternal grandmother looking down her slender nose over her gold glasses and informing my father that our house had mice, and my mother looking like she wanted to crawl away and hide somewhere. Was it like that? No, it wasn't like that. But we weren't sure what it was at all. What things belonged to the ghosts and what belonged to the house? Well, the first thing I ruled out in my child brain were cabinets and doors do not open on their own, and that this behavior belonged to the ghosts. I came to the conclusion when I was sitting at our smooth, large oval kitchen table coloring with my crayons. My mother had put away the clean dishes and left the room. Shortly thereafter, one by one, the drawers slid open and the cabinet doors opened. Not all at once, no, but not in any order. I just paused and watched and felt fear, but not enough for flight. I gave that title Ghosts to this behavior. I want to take this moment to describe to anyone who hasn't seen a ghost before what exactly the moment feels like. It's not unlike when you're walking in the dark up some stairs and you think you have one extra step than you do. Your foot falls to the landing of the staircase, and in that moment your heart goes to your throat and your stomach goes to your knees. Have you ever felt the immediate imbalance of picking up something your body prepares to be heavy, only to find it to be incredibly light? Perhaps you felt the quick and sudden fear when you think you've dropped your cell phone in water or on pavement, only to find it was safe. It's the sudden intensity of emotion that hits you. Your body doesn't like what it's seeing, and it gives you immediate negative emotions and reactions. Your body has saved up worst-case scenario emotions and projectiles these to you. Most children are afraid of monsters in their closet, and I wasn't an exception. I recalled a persistent fear I had of a gorilla that I believed lived there. During the day and at night, I would see this massive black figure looming in my closet, passing by the door as it would walk back and forth. My sister and I shared this bedroom, and it had a walk-in closet. I distinctly remember fur and black eyes and this heavy breathing. My child brain didn't conclude that this was a monster, but specifically a gorilla, which of course a loose gorilla is terrifying, but when it comes to ghouls and goblins it's far down on the list. When I was about 9 though, things began to slowly escalate. I don't know what the cause for this was, or what event took place to cause the acceleration. Maybe there was no reason for this, or maybe I just became more perceptive. My parents' bedroom was at the end of the hall next to the bathroom. Their bedroom was always the spookiest, overshadowing the basements or closets, or other standard terrifying locations of large households. Beneath our basement stair was a storage space with a sliding door. This caused me so many nightmares, and still my parents' bedroom was somehow worse than this. It was pretty to look at, with a big waterbed and floral bedding striped wallpaper and ceiling with flecks of glitter. Their big window overlooking the backyard had flouncy white curtains with pink bows holding them back. They had a large window bench that I won so many games of hide and seek by slipping inside of. The floors were smooth and shiny, and it always smelled like my mother's perfume, which was and still is Red Door by Elizabeth Arden. Next to my parents' bedroom was the upstairs bathroom, which was the main bath and quite large. There was a large adjacent room to the bathroom and my parents' bedroom. The entryway to this room was through the bathroom, and it had an exterior window that, instead of looking outside, looked into my parents' bedroom. I don't understand why it was built this way, or what renovation was done prior to us that made it this way, but it was a large, strange, dark room. Mum would put all of our seasonal clothes back there, and I only ever accessed it during these times when we would make the switch. The entry door was to an exterior door, not an interior door, so it had a glass window that Mum placed a curtain over. If you were in the bathtub leaning back, you had a full view of this door. I would try to position myself so that I wouldn't see it. My fear was that something would escape from my parents' bedroom door through that window, go into this storage room, and come out through the door and take me. Passing my parents' bedroom to get to the bathroom was always a daunting task for any of us, where we'd stare into the depths of their bedroom while passing by until we were safely tucked inside the bathroom, then rushing past it when we left. It was not uncommon to pass by and see a curtain move suddenly, or see something suddenly fall, such as a picture off the wall or a book tip over on the dresser. There was definitely a reason we were afraid of it. I remember it was autumn, and although only about 4 p.m., it was getting dim outside. I was reading on my bed by myself when I needed to use the bathroom. I so clearly remember setting the book down, face down, so as to not lose my spot, and my room being a very pale grey shade as the sun was starting to dim. I walked and pressed against the other side of the hallway, my feet walking as quietly and stealthily as I could, but it was to no avail. As soon as I passed, my eyes straining as hard as I could into the room to make sure I was safe, I locked onto the figure of a child. Her back was to me, and she was facing the bed. She had on a pale-coloured nightgown, maybe blue or green, and her hair was short, in a page boy fashion, and light brown. She did not move or acknowledge me in any way. I stood frozen and unblinking for about 8 seconds, then just spun around and went downstairs instead. This began a winter of us frequently witnessing the other children who seemed to still live there. We came to the conclusion that we simply weren't the only children that lived in that house. You caught glimpses of them as they rounded a corner. When you closed a door, you'd hear them whisper just before it latched shut, and you could pull the door open as quickly as you'd like. But when you'd glanced over, there'd be no one there, and you'd just have an empty room staring back at you defiantly. I remember vividly washing the dishes and standing on my stool to reach the sink. I could look out the kitchen window to the alleyway and some of the backyard. A little girl looked up at me, waved, and then walked towards the alleyway. She passed through the wooden fence like it wasn't there at all, and perhaps it wasn't there for her when she was here. It was as if the more we acknowledged them, the more frequently we began to see them. Sharon and I had a long winter of sharing events together, as we shared a bedroom and had many experiences there. Once I was lying in bed with my lamp on, reading a Babysitter Club paperback, when Sally jerked awake and yelped. Her headboard slammed into the wall, and her bed screeched on the wooden floor. It was a sudden, forceful motion. She claims she was sound asleep, and in her dream, a large black dog crashed through our window and onto her bed, right on top of her. And from where I sat, it did indeed look like something had just put one of their feet on the end of her bed and shoved it against the wall. Regardless of what actually happened, the fact remained that she responded to a physical interaction that was unseen to me. During this time, I suffered from horrific nightmares and night terrors. My dad had carried me out of my bed screaming on more than one occasion when I was younger, and now that I was slightly older, I most likely just woke myself up and sat in the dark until I calmed down. Sometimes it was too much. I would often wake Sally up, although just feet away from me, and ask if I could sleep with her. At some time prior, we had gotten our own full-size beds, and I hated sleeping alone. My sister always let me crawl into her bed, but never came into mine. Later she told me it was because from where she laid in bed, she could see underneath my bed, and that a lady was lying on the floor beneath mine on her back, looking up at the mattress. She would occasionally tilt her head all of the way back to look at my sister. This implied that her feet were beneath my head, and that my feet above her head. I think this came to my mum's attention at some point, because eventually we got bed skirts on our beds, another haunted house hangover that has continued into my adult life. Always hide what's underneath the bed. Sally and I went through a period of awful insomnia and waking up through the night frequently. We'd stay up all night reading and talking, maybe listening to a CD. If we'd fall asleep, something would jolt us awake, and this made us become lethargic during the day and irritable to others. I believe this was specifically because we had begun to openly discuss these incidents and were thankfully acknowledging it out loud now as we were growing up. We began to voice our nightmares with agitation and became frustrated with our current conditions. On one particular day, we were in the basement drawing on our chalkboard, maybe playing hangman or something. We heard someone walk down the basement steps and across the concrete floor to us. It was loud and clear enough that we both looked around the wall from where we were out to the main hallway area of the basement. No one was there, but instead of ignoring it like we usually would have, we both decided to rush upstairs away from the invisible intruder, as it felt a bit troublesome. Once upstairs, we decided to turn on the TV, but every time we did, it would shut itself back off. This was in the days where you pressed the TV power button to turn it on, and then the CBL button, then the power button to turn on the cable box. Once the TV would start and the screen would turn on, it would zap to dark. Unsure if this was electrical or paranormal, we went up to our bedroom. We were barely in the bedroom when there was an enormous gust of wind that slammed our door shut. It startled us both, so we jumped, and I recall Sally quickly grabbing the doorknob to pull the door open, but we couldn't get it open, and my father eventually had to take the door handle off with a screwdriver to get us out. We never replaced the doorknob. In the meantime, my older sister had moved her bedroom from upstairs to the main floor in the old den. She had a bigger area and liked her privacy. However, she was tormented by spiders, suffering from arachnophobia, and this was especially cruel. She would go upstairs and wake me up nearly nightly to come down and kill a spider that would be in her room. They seemed to congregate just above her head. I would be half awake, standing over her bed, squishing a big brown spider with a shoe or the end of a broom. While this was an old house, and we had the occasional house spider, they did not accumulate anywhere else in the house, or at least not in the way they did here. I recall my dad doing bug bombs in the house, and we all had to leave the house for the day with our dogs, but regrettably, this still did not diminish them. My parents were incredibly poor, and still forked over the large fee to have an exterminator come and spray the house. They'd be gone for a few days, and then the spiders would slowly start to build up. I remember killing 6 spiders in her room one night that were all hovering right above her bed. This again happened just frequently enough in a secluded area that it changed from what belonged to the house to what belonged to the ghosts. That summer that followed was the last season we spent in the house, and subsequently the worst one we had. The events began to happen more and more frequently, with all of us voicing new experiences, and it was becoming more aggressive and assertive. The ghosts were laying claim over what belonged to them more and more. We were not educated on how to fight, so it was a losing battle. I think that the only thing that kept them at bay so much was the fact that we had so many religious and spiritual materials in the house. My brother reported a hand grabbing his side and pinching him in the middle of the night between his bed and wall, as if it was trying to grasp him and unable to get a firm grip on him. This seemed to happen to him nearly nightly, until he moved his bed from that wall completely. My brother asked me once if I recalled the brass coat rack in the piano room. It had engravings of animals on it, and Mum hung her and Dad's dress coats on it. I instantly recalled hiding behind it and the smell of Dad's cologne on his sports coats. Then I recalled the feeling of being trapped in them and cold fingertips from somewhere in the dark of the coats touching my cheeks and arms. We each reported seeing very opaque black shadows, and I recall seeing it behind me while I brushed my teeth in the mirror, and it was so terrifying. The most tumultuous day we had was an overcast August day. It was tailing towards the end of summer, and we were getting in the last few days of swimming in our above-ground pool before the season ended. Even being overcast and a bit on the chilly side, we braved it. and the events unfolded as follows. Mum was cutting Dennis's hair outside, and Mary was swimming. Sally and I was watching a Disney Channel special on the Backstreet Boys. When it ended, I went upstairs to put on my swimsuit and expected it to be in the laundry basket in my parents' room. I remember glancing out the window and seeing Mary swimming in the pool. It wasn't there, so I went to the basement to find it hanging in the shower. Sally decided to watch more TV, and Dennis wasn't planning on swimming, so it'd just be Mary and I. On the main floor, we had a door that opened up to a large deck, and if you descended those stairs, you'd walk down the deck that wrapped around the pool. I remember coming out and waving at Mary. The image of her in the pool is so burnt into my mind that now, 21 years later, I could still sit and draw you a detailed image. Her long, dark curls were floating around her in the pool. Her shoulders just above water, her face looked pale, and her eyes glassy. She neither smiled nor waved back. Only in retrospect can I say that this was the expression someone would have when they say, "You look like you've seen a ghost." As soon as I was in the pool, she grabbed my arm and pointed at my parents' bedroom and asked me, "Did you see that girl?" And I did. She was like a watercolor stain, just barely there. She wasn't in front of the window nor behind it. It's like she was the window. She looked down at us and waved. We waved back. She looked over her shoulder, and then another girl came forward and melted into her. She waved and we waved. And this continued as child after child morphed and appeared in the window. We could see clothes, hair colors, and expression. I recall a red-headed boy crying and a girl pulling him away and scowling at us. There was also frequently a tall lady that hovered somewhere behind them, only momentarily coming into view when the children were coming or going. We did subtle experiments to see how much they could interact with us. I moved from one side of the pool to the other, where I could not see the windows, and Mary confirmed that they pointed to where I was when I waved. We didn't speak to them, and they didn't speak to us. I hadn't even submerged myself in the water, and it was at that exact moment when I had gotten into the pool that it began, and it did not relent. At one point, a girl began to excitedly point behind us, and shortly thereafter my father pulled into the driveway. That was my breaking point. I think it was her knowing something was about to happen, as opposed to what was happening when it broke me. I told Mary I wanted out of the pool and to go inside. I told her to pull her ladder on so we could shakily get out. In retrospect now, the idea of having one of these events seems ludicrous, but makes the most sense to me. I imagine this lady ushering kids to see us in and out of a portal. It felt like a dark, morbid parade, of which I'm still unsure the meaning behind. We met my mum in the basement, where she was switching the wash around. I remember the cold air conditioning on my arms adding to the chill I had. I cried while Mary and I explained what we had seen for the better part of an hour. My mum was at this point fed up and frustrated. I remember thinking she was being cold and callous, but how could I think she was at her wit's end? What could she do for her kids? Before dinner, we all sat at our kitchen table and talked about the house. My dad sat at the head of the table, his fingertips making a steeple while he listened to us kids insist that this was real, and we had all experienced this and were tired of being scared. There were a lot of sniffles and crying. I remember all of us purging experiences we'd each had, some not shared with others, and just this feeling of exhaustion. My dad then agreed, and I remember my mum's face when he did, as if he had betrayed her. But he sighed and had to nod. He too had been experiencing things since they had first moved in, things he kept in the back of his mind, and things he knew which were not normal. Dad had a habit of always being the last to bed, and would lie on the floor in front of the TV with one of our dogs and drink his Mountain Dew or munch his popcorn until he was so tired he just had to go to bed. He said he would frequently see shadows darting around the corners of the room. One was large enough that he got up and followed it, thinking it was an animal or a child wandering around. He said he fell asleep once in front of the TV, and woke up to static, as this is what TVs did back in the day. He leaned forward to turn the TV on from the box when the big leveled glass screen went black, and he saw a man behind him, leaning forwards as if he was looking at his reflection. He was pale, with dark eyes, wearing a suit. Dad said he turned around swinging, thinking someone was actually there. But there was no one, and the living room loomed quiet and dim behind him. He said he went into the bathroom at night on the main floor, and something would shake the knob and knock on the door. Mary confirmed this, as where her bedroom went into the main floor, that was her primary bathroom. She would often experience this too. She recalled passing her bedroom door and seeing the shadow of someone's feet beneath it. She got as far as to lie on the floor and look under the door, but unlike the movies, she could see someone's feet. So she jumped up and opened her door, but no one was there. This was when she had Dad install a lock on her bedroom door. Dad expressed that not only did he feel unease, but he also knew others had too. One summer we took a trip to see Mum's family out of state, and my dad's younger brother house sat for us. He told Dad later he slept every night with a knife under the couch, as the upstairs was too frightening. He would hear people walking up and down the steps at night, and attested to people attempting to get into the bathroom when he was in it. He kept the dogs with him and closed the French doors to the piano room, successfully closing off the stairs to his view. One day, Dad and a friend of his were trying to get a bat out of the sunroom behind the bathroom. We occasionally got bats in the house, and they frequently stayed between my parents' room and the bathroom. I think this just went hand in hand with having a house that was so old in a neighborhood of old houses. His friend claimed that when he turned to leave the sunroom, he could see someone staring through the door from the bathroom at him. It was just a moment, and they were gone. He had another friend who was helping him work on his car in the garage. He went across the backyard and into the basement door. They went to Dad's workbench to get a tool they needed, and he told Dad that his hair stood on end the entire time he was in there, like someone was watching him. His mouth went dry, and he refused to go back into the house. The conclusion of this family event was to call our priest for a blessing. You see, I grew up a very strict Roman Catholic, and most of my family still practices. We went to church and heard his sermon every Sunday for years, and I received my first Holy Communion from him, as had my siblings. He was very intent on listening to what we had to say, and came over to bless the house. However, when he walked through the house, and didn't see or feel anything himself, he determined there was nothing wrong. My mum made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table and had spice cake and discussed things in hushed tones. I recall my siblings and I feeling discouraged. He still blessed the house, but nothing more. I still feel that my mum saw this as a win for her, as if the house was fine and it was us who were in the wrong. My mum decided that we, then, as a group, would say the original St. Michael prayer. The original version, which is about 135 years old, was much lengthier, with a truncated version developed for the Roman ritual of exorcism. We went through the house praying together, with a blessed lit candle and sprinkling holy water. This tiny ceremony we did was incredibly haunting, and I remember feeling a great suspense and nervousness wash over me. I don't think anything took, as it was only a few weeks later, on one last burst of summer. We were all outside doing chores and prepping the yard for winter. Mary and I both saw then a tall, slender lady in my parents' bedroom looking out at us. She had her hands holding the back part of the curtain and gazed out. In my mind, she had a very Morticia Addams feel to her, with her dark dress and dark hair. But the feeling that radiated from her was malice and wicked, and not a gentle mother. We couldn't get anyone else to see her, though. They saw the fluttering of the curtain, But that was not an unexplainable phenomenon. My parents ended up suffering a foreclosure on the home that summer. It was a cool day, the first breezes of autumn coming in, when Dad had discussed what he would do to salvage the mortgage. In the end, they opted to let it foreclose. When we were told we had 1 week to vacate, it was sad, but also deeply liberating. So when I told you we really couldn't afford to leave, I meant it sincerely. The foreclosure was the only way we were able to get out. I was the last one to leave on our final day there. I remember doing a brief walk through the upstairs, then the main floor, leaving out the front. I was only 11, but the house felt so strange that day, and millions of other things I didn't understand at the time. Words now like bleak, forlorn, empty, desolate, grim, dismal, and barren come to mind. I remember closing my bedroom window and hearing everyone getting ready to leave the house. I pulled shut every bedroom door as I left the room, making sure to hear them latch behind me. I walked slowly down the steps, running my hand down the banister, knowing I would never feel it again. I walked to the kitchen and made sure the windows were closed and locked. I closed my sister's bedroom door and made sure it was locked. The house was nearly empty, but we didn't trash it with what we had left behind. Items we decided not to take were left packed in boxes and labeled in the basement. We left the piano, and I closed the lid to the keys. I could hear my family out by our big van, moving items inside and talking. I felt a world away from them. My last view from where I stood before pulling the front door closed was the piano room. The stairs, a peek into the beginning of a quiet kitchen, the living room through the French doors bare of their previous lace curtains. I had this feeling like the house was poised and expectant behind me. I knew the analogy that had been used, but it truly felt like a gaping mouth. That view was the last of the house, the last parts I had ever seen of it. A few years later, my dad drove past and saw a family that appeared to be moving out. It was the dead of Midwestern winter, with about a foot of snow. He parked in front and waved out of his window. I don't know all the specific details, but they had lived there for about 2 years and were moving. Dad said his accent was thick, but he kept saying the house was no good. My dad waited some time, and then had gone back to the house when it was vacant. He walked through and looked at everything. They had covered the wooden floors with carpet. My mum's color scheme of varying shades of blue, white, and greys through the house were replaced with these intense primary shades. Strangely, it appeared the bathtub may have fallen through the floor, which might be what they meant when they said it was no good. They had taken down parts of the deck and taken the pool out too. The privacy fence was gone, and for some reason a lot of the windows were boarded up. It sat this way for quite a few years while the city argued what to do with it. It slowly fell further into disrepair until it didn't look like a house anymore. Before they ended up tearing it down, my dad had gone back and taken 2 photos with his cell phone. This was still many years ago, so they weren't very great, but they're the last photos of the house that we have, and it's absolutely destroyed. The windows have no glass, and their black drapes stare out at you. I've spent so many hours over the years lying and staring at the photos, my eyes straining to see if something is in those windows looking out at us. There isn't. In those photos, it's just a busted up, beat down old house, standing broken in the snow. If anyone else has grown up in a haunted house, they can testify for you that these memories are not like memories you have elsewhere in homes. There is a disturbing connection you'll always feel, a deep calling almost, to think about and obsess over. It's so hard to let it go. There are days now that I allow myself to completely sink into the memories of that house and how it felt. I try to remember the smell of it, the specific fabrics inside. I try to recall where everything went and what bedrooms smelt like. The momentary basking is quickly replaced with the memory of something else that may have happened. There was one afternoon, in the kitchen of my parents' current home, where they had lived them for the past 21 years, when my mum revealed something to me. The former owners of the house were the first people, not of the original lineage in some form or another, that had lived in that house. They bought it back in the 60s and had lived there for almost 30 years before moving to a smaller retirement home. Their lady, Mrs. Venamutu, liked to have seance parties and play with the Ouija board. My bedroom had been their master bedroom, I'm guessing due to the large closet size, and my parents' bedroom was their seance room, all tucked away in the back of the house. It's my firm belief that Miss Venamutu opened up a portal that she either failed to close or chose not to. I've had discussions with friends who I grew up with that remembered our old house. Most remembered the pool parties and the big basement we played in. One friend in specific, who I am still friends with to this day, has had deeper reminiscences with me. She told me she was scared to be anywhere alone in the house, and that her parents had talked in their own house about the eeriness of our house after dinner parties or holiday gatherings. Apparently her mum felt the house was terrifying and would try and get out of being invited. There are so many little experiences that are left out, so many that are forgotten with time. There are whispers that I can't recall their sounds, only that I heard them. There are moments where I only remember the terror I felt, but not the experience. There are nightmares I woke up screeching from that I still recall to this day, and nights I only remember waking up in tears. There are memories I have that belong to the house and belong to the ghosts. Now with the house gone, I suppose the ghosts don't belong to anywhere. My parents' current house is a tidy yellow colonial-style home that is quite full of cheer and quiet. However, during my first 15 years of living there, I had some very specific paranormal events. I don't believe these belonged to the house, though I think these were things that happened incidentally. While we all experienced strange things at the house, I was the only one who continued to have experiences outside of this. The first experience was that of a doppelganger. I know they are portrayed as a harbinger of bad luck, but I've never witnessed any exceptionally bad luck after seeing one. I think they are spirits whose only power is to mimic in voice or appearance, and have no other ability. The first one I had seen was of Sally. It was a day when only the three of us younger children were home, and Mary and my parents were all at their respective workplaces. I recall we were going up to paint Sally's room, but first I had to use the bathroom and would then follow them up. I grabbed the garbage bags on my way out of the bathroom and headed upstairs. Passing the living room, I saw, sitting on the couch, Sally, watching me. I told her that I had already got the garbage bags and went upstairs. When I was walking up the stairs, my feet suddenly felt sluggish. Something was off. When I got to Sally's bedroom, I could see her sitting on the floor opening cans of paint. It clicked then, that it felt off when I had seen her. I had seen a slightly younger version of her in a typical school outfit. Sally saw my face fall flat and searched the house with me while I explained what happened. My next experience there was at night, when I was awake alone. I was eating a midnight snack in the kitchen. Adjacent to the kitchen, there's an enclosed porch, and the door has a big glass window on it so that you can see into the other room. I was leaning against the sink eating my food when I saw a little girl frantically press herself against the glass. My heart jumped into my throat, and I took a step forward to help her when she was gone. It was so instantaneous and she looked so real. I remember her little fist pulling back to pound on the glass right before she was gone. The next incident was a secondary doppelganger sighting of my sister Mary. It was our night to make dinner, and we were doing tacos. She suggested I go upstairs and get a CD to play. I had rushed upstairs to my bedroom, and again, when coming back down, saw Mary in her bedroom. Her back was to me and she was standing looking out her window. She was pushing her vertical blinds open, as they were all the rage at this time, and seemed to be peering out into the dark sky. I asked if she was okay, but my mouth felt like cotton. That awful feeling was back, and I knew something was wrong. It was right next to the landing of the stairs. My foot was ready to flee the minute things went south, and they did. As soon as I had asked her, she began to walk backwards to me, not turning around. I remember the swishing of the plastic vertical blinds as she let them go, and the frantic, heavy footsteps. I ran down the steps and paused at the bottom, but no one followed me. I knew she would be gone anyway. The last incident to occur in the home was before I moved out, when I was a late teen. I was talking to a long-distance boyfriend on my cell phone. I was pacing back and forth, doing the weird positions and footwork you do when you're in a long phone call. And when I glanced up, a tall, dark-haired woman stood next to my bedroom door in profile. Her hair hung forward, so I could only see her forehead and nose, and then she was gone. It was enough for me to get an eyeful, but not long enough to form a proper reaction. Outside of this house at the time, I was experiencing completely different things. My siblings and I frequently walked to our local library, and I spent so much of my youth buried in books, whether at home or sitting in their overstuffed chairs. It was such a day that I was seated at a table, looking at a giant, hardback books on old artwork. A red-headed lady walked up to me and commented that the painting I was looking at was beautiful. I still remember it was called Our English Coast by William Holman Hunt, a gorgeous painting that still leaves me feeling some kind of way when I see it. I agreed with her, and it was beautiful. She asked me if I knew who John Coolier was, and I said I didn't. So I followed her to the back of the library, where all of the big old art books were. She was taller than me, slender, wearing a denim jacket and denim jeans. Her hair was red and wiry, reaching just past her shoulders. She had her hair pushed back by her sunglasses, and I remember she had chunky turquoise jewelry on. And I instantly just thought she was the coolest lady, and 14-year-old me was enamored, and that she was going to have a conversation with me. Our library isn't massive, but it's quite large and only 2 stories. But the upstairs is where all the art books were tucked, back in a corner, and it was my favorite place to sit and look at the pictures and be in the quiet and dim-lit areas. However, as we wove through the aisles and aisles where she talked quietly about his artwork, I began to have this sinking feeling. Alarm bells were going off every which way, and every stranger danger conversation I had ever had with my parents or any other slightly authoritative figure ran through my brain. Then she stopped right before the books and began pulling them out one at a time, until she found the one she approved of. She turned to me and handed me the large flat book and said, "He's a must. You'll absolutely love his artwork too." She said a few other words, but they were lost on me as my eyes blurred over and my face flushed. Her face was wrong. It looked like that of a hog. Her eyes were big, round and black, while her nose was upturned and squashed, her bottom teeth protruding upwards and large. I took the book into my 2 damp hands, thanking her and choking on my words, unable to form a proper sentence. She had just moved a little too close to me, so I turned abruptly and fled. I set the book on some random table when I passed my siblings and told them I was leaving, and kept going until they caught up with me. Halfway home, I didn't understand why this experience had happened. She didn't harm me. She wasn't awful. She just also didn't seem like she needed help or to convey a significant message. Or was she just an awful person? And this was her secret side. Shortly after, my older sister Mary decided to move out. I went with her to numerous locations as she decided on a house to rent with her roommates. I remember this was when I began to pinpoint the feeling you got when you walked into a haunted house. It was a feeling akin to what I nearly felt all of the time at our old house. I felt it a few times and would tell Mary, who thankfully always believed me and never made me feel insane or that I was making it up. One such location, I recall, instantly feeling awful. We pulled up in front of the house, and I immediately was against it. The feeling was so intense that I began to feel lightheaded. The downside was, Mary fell in love with it. It was big, with a large screened-in porch overlooking a flat backyard. It had 3 bedrooms, 2 full bathrooms, and a fireplace in the dining room. My most vivid memory is walking up the stairs and staring down a long hallway. The walls were a dark yellow mustard color, and the house was overly warm in the summer heat. Something about it felt and smelt like nicotine and the thickness of old spider webs. At the end of the hallway was a linen closet. It was the pivotal moment in a horror movie where I would open the linen closet, the music would be sharp, and there would be something inside to grab me. But there wasn't, because life doesn't offer the soundtrack cues. Instead, I would hear Mary's voice downstairs talking with her roommates like a soft buzzing. I opened the linen closet to empty shelves and peeling wallpaper. There was still something awful about it though, and I closed it quickly. I peeked into the bedrooms and the bathrooms, and then walked downstairs. I had the intrusive image of a man crawling naked quickly to me from the bathroom floor with a shaved head and a mouth full of razor blades. It was there for a moment and gone in my head, but it was enough to make me want to walk much quicker. Unfortunately, Mary and her roommates decided to go with this place. I beseeched her that something was off and it wasn't a good idea, but they allowed animals and it was a good price, so they went for it. I was reluctant to help unpack or to come over at all. I saw her only 3 times when she lived there, and it was once to help unpack the kitchen and set up an aquarium, for a visit with her and her roommates, and finally to help her pack up. The visit was the reason I never went back. I was spending the night towards the end of summer, and the house was stuffy and humid. The central air never worked quite right, and the August humidity seeped inside the walls. Mary's significant other Brenda wanted to set up the basement as a cool smoke spot, with beanbags and posters and a record player. They had asked me to come down and see what I thought, and I obliged. I nodded along to conversation, but I just had this deeply unsettling feeling, and I wanted to leave as soon as possible. The basement had another section to it, so we looked over there and talked about using it for storage. I noticed along the walls there was an aluminium square in the wall like a small door. I asked Brenda what it was, but she didn't know. We went over to it and investigated. Inside there was a Christmas cookie tin that we opened. Dear listener, allow me to explain the deep disquiet I felt inside me upon opening this tin. Inside, there were multiple locks of braided hair. They were definitely human in different colors. I did feel them, and they weren't made of nylon or another synthetic material. There are some kind of explanations that they weren't malevolent. Perhaps they were used to trim, or for a drag king's beard, perhaps not. We simply disposed of the tin. One of Mary's roommates came home late and said he had gotten us some good weed to smoke. At this time I was 15 and had only smoked once or twice with Mary. I was still new and nervous. I remember her roommate holding my bangs back for me as I tried to light it and guiding me. Unfortunately, this smoking session ended badly for me, and I became incredibly green sick, even though I passed after just a few hits. I remember sitting on the played sofa, becoming too aware of my own physical self, the prickling feeling my skin had from the heat, the sweat that would gather beneath my hair, and that I couldn't get a breath of cool air. Mary picked up pretty quick that I wasn't doing okay, and took me upstairs to lie down in her bed. She had a window AC unit, and it was much cooler in there. I lay on top of her cloud print bedspread and drifted in and out of sleep. I had awful dreams of the naked man crawling in strange ways up and down the hall and peering into each room when he came. His eyes were blindfolded sometimes, and other times they weren't. It was as if he was bent in bad ways and rolling his limbs to pull himself along. I got up at some point, feeling very nauseated, and had to leave the room to go to the bathroom. At this time, Brenda was coming up the stairs and saw me. She said I was incredibly pale and drenched in sweat. I don't have a clear memory of all this, but she went into the tiny bathroom with me and asked if I wanted her to run me a cool shower. I said yes, but my next memory was her in the shower with me, both of our clothes on and her behind me, with her arms holding me tightly, calling for my sister. I don't recall anything after this, but waking up the next day feeling pretty worn out. However, I recall the awful dreams I had the entire time. I recalled dreaming in and out of consciousness about this man. In my dream, he crawled along the wall and on the ceiling above Brenda, watching her take me into the bathroom. I talked about being thirsty and my eyes feeling hot. As Brenda ran water and said I was okay, when I pulled the shower curtain open, the man was standing in there, his head bent to the side, and it touched the ceiling. His mouth was lined with razor blades, and as he opened it, the blood poured out and down his chin. He ran his hands over his bald head and said, "No hair," which is silly and not all that scary. I tried to get away from him, but he grabbed my shirt and started pulling me into the tub with him. And as my foot went inside, there was no bottom to the tub. The next morning, Mary said they all had a bad experience with the weed, and it was possibly laced. She said they all just felt queasy and woke up miserable. She said Brenda came up to check on me and said I looked like a zombie. She went to get me and cool me down in the shower, but when she turned the water on, I started crying and shaking. I generally seemed hysterical. I had never had an experience smoking like that before or since then. Regardless if this was laced or not, I fully believe that this house was explicitly to blame for the weird situation. When I was in my early teens, my paternal grandmother was diagnosed with lung cancer. She needed someone to help care for her, so twice a week, I would spend the day and night there with her. If I hadn't clarified, we were homeschooled, so there weren't limitations to the homeschool schedule. These would be the days that she had her chemo and radiation therapy, so there would be someone to make her dinner and get her into bed. This went on for a few years until she went into remission. It consumed a great deal of my life as our lives began to coexist, and I had to give myself over to her. She was never a kind woman in her young and older years. She'd been married multiple times, each marriage ending in her spouse's death, and she was a drunkard until her pancreas just gave out. She verbally, emotionally, and physically abused my father and was known for her rowdy street fights when drunk. She picked me apart, what I wore, how I dressed, how much I weighed, how I was doing in school, who my friends were, and how I spent my free time. She became very reliant on me, as I was the one who did her dishes, kept her house clean, bathed her dog, and even eventually did her hair colors and perms. I would stand in her basement ironing her blouses before doing my homework. I hated it there so much, but not for any of these reasons, no. What I especially hated was the bedroom I slept in. This bedroom was small, with a large queen-size bed, with a soft pink blanket on it, and 2 white pillows. There was a large painting of Jesus Christ knocking on someone's door above the head with a dresser and a mirror attached, next to a tiny closet. If you sat up in bed, you looked straight into this mirror. There wasn't much room for walking around, just enough to get in a door and out. And when you went through her side door to enter the house, straight ahead of you were the basement stairs. To your left was the kitchen, and to your right was this bedroom door. The secondary bedroom door opened up into the hallway next to the other bedrooms. There was the main floor and the basement, no upper level. The basement was fully furnished with a bathroom, sofa, and TV, and that's where I spent nearly all my free time. This is to emphasize that this bedroom was so terrifying that I would slip out the side door and down the basement steps to relieve myself of the oppression. The one window in the room had a shade on it, and a white valance. Every night I went to sleep, I would open this shade up all the way to let the streetlights in. I cannot in any words fully express to you my sincerity when I tell you that no light could penetrate this darkness. I would see the glow around this window, but none of it reflected off any surface in the room. That is not to say until the sun rose. It appeared that the minute the sun went down, this room dipped into the darkness like it was settling at the bottom of the ocean. I would wave my hand in front of my face and never see it. I wouldn't see movement in the mirror in front of me. I even brought a nightlight that went into an outlet by the bed on the floor. I'm still keen on these in my much older age, to softly illuminate rooms in the dark to act to guide your feet in case a dog is somehow beneath you. This again didn't illuminate my room. I could see the faceplate behind the outlet and the soft Berber carpeting immediately beneath it, but it didn't cast any light further. It was like looking at a single star in the night sky, but seeing no others. I lay awake night after night in this bed, until I either drifted off to sleep, the sun came up, or the oppression became so bad I had to escape and sleep on the basement sofa. If you're wondering why I didn't do this regularly, it's because my grandmother wanted me within speaking distance to hear her if she fell off the bed or needed me, as this bedroom was right next to hers. Even down the hall and on the living room sofa, which was a fancy, stiff floral sofa that I couldn't imagine trying to become comfortable on while sleeping, as I often couldn't while sitting. I also wanted to prove to myself that I could do it, even though I never could. Dear listener, my first episode of sleep paralysis was as follows. I was lying on my back, my fingers moving softly back and forth on the soft pink blanket. I was staring into the nothingness that surrounded me, and I began to feel someone crawl into bed with me. I meant to jerk away from it, to leap out of bed and throw open the door and yell, but I couldn't move. My two small fingers gently going side to side was the only movement my body allowed. My heart was pounding. My eyes began to stream tears, and I tried to yell, and heard only a small gurgle in the back of my throat. But onwards this person crawled, slowly taking their time, as if they were patting the bed around to see where I was. I heard a wet sound, a slopping sound like someone squeezing something wet until it squelches. I remember holding my breath, my eyes darting around frantically, trying to make out the shape, anything to see who my assaulters were. I felt them press their face between my neck and shoulder, and their top teeth sinking into me. The feeling of their wet, meaty tongue lying against my skin. Eventually the pressure and pain became too much, and I burst out of my sleep paralysis. When I was suddenly able to move and sit up, I burst into tears and frantically left the room and went to the bathroom. There were no bite marks, no sign that anything had happened, but that sickly feeling of biting was still there. That is a feeling that has stuck with me still. I can close my eyes and remember how it felt. I settled on the fact that it must have been a dream and stayed up watching TV until Grandma woke. It took me a long time to fall asleep there again, and when I did, it was with the overhead light on. Going forward from there, sleep paralysis was something I continually suffered with in her house for the following years. It was too dark for me to see what the creature was, but I could feel it. I trained myself to fall back asleep while moving my feet against one another or swishing them back and forth, and moving my hand in some sort of repetitive motion. This way, if I woke up in sleep paralysis, I could focus on that movement to help pull me out. This is something I do to this day. I did experience it some other times at Grandma's house, 2 of which were witnessed by my sister, Sally, and I was able to bribe her into coming with me. One event was a Saturday evening. Grandma had gone to church with her brother and his wife, and we opted to stay at her house. Grandma had also asked us to dust and vacuum the basement, so we were doing that until they came back. We were alone down there, chatting to one another. At the other side of the big room when we began to hear voices trickling down quietly through the vents. The ceiling was low, so you had to stand and place your hand flat on it, so where we stood, we could look right up into them. One vent was connected to the bathroom vent, and that is where we could hear it more clearly. I went upstairs while she listened and searched the rooms. Surely a radio alarm clock was going off. 2 of the 2 TVs were left on and a window was open, and neighbors were speaking. I stood directly over the bathroom vent and spoke with my sister, who could hear me clearly. She could hear the voices, but I couldn't locate the reasonable source for them, nor hear them while they were upstairs. They escalated to the point where they began to sound upset, and we made out that there were 2 women arguing about one of them talking about something of the others. One of them clearly began to sound like Grandma, which wasn't possible as her voice was securely placed inside her throat, which she was alive and at church. Eventually we just turned the downstairs TV on to drown it out. A secondary instance was us sitting up late on the living room floor, wrapping the Christmas presents for her other grandchildren, which was a weird punishment. We wrapped gifts for children who never spoke to her, while we took care of her and received none. This was just typical Grandma behavior. Grandma had wrapped gifts at a department store 100 years ago, and she was very specific on how it was done and how it looked. It took us all night sitting there on the carpet, carefully wrapping with straight lines and the least amount of tape possible. We were facing the same direction, watching Adult Swim on mute. We both clearly saw the bottom half of the woman walking from the bathroom into the guest room down the hall. It was just her thin legs and her nightgown that brushed her shins. The thing was, it looked just like Grandma's legs. It walked like she did. It was the same white nightgown she always wore, with the frilly bottom hem and the sewn-on pink flowers. It couldn't have been her real legs because they were currently attached to her torso, and they were in her bedroom. She was also very much alive, so it shouldn't have been her ghost. Yet unmistakably, we both swore they were her legs. To bring us forward to the future, when Grandma went into remission, I stopped babysitting her and got my own job and quickly moved out of my parents' home. My first place of residence was with 2 friends of mine in a house they rented. We only lived there for 7 months before their lease was up, and we went elsewhere together. However, they quickly introduced me to what they called the Phantom Music Box. This is precisely as it sounds. In our little kitchen that had a door leading to our backyard and was outside of my bedroom, you could hear soft music box sounds tinkling through the air. I had suspected it was a joke they played on me, so in my first chance alone where I felt emboldened, I scoured the kitchen. I stood on the counters and looked on top of cabinets. I pulled out everything in the Lazy Susan, and I looked behind the fridge, under the table, to see if it was glued to the underside. While it wasn't a large kitchen, I spent about a half hour looking for this music box or radio. I knew it wasn't in my room, which was in the adjacent room. My next option was underneath the kitchen, in the basement, where one of my roommates' bedrooms was. While I didn't feel good searching their items, I still walked into their room and listened for the source. I couldn't hear the music louder anywhere. In fact, unless you stood in the kitchen, you wouldn't hear the music anywhere else in the house. Some people could hear it, and some people couldn't. It was a strange phenomena, and while eerie, not altogether scary or malicious. I only had sleep paralysis once in this residence, but the entity stayed at the end of the bedroom. It started off the same way it did at Grandma's house, so I knew it was the same experience. Luckily, I was able to wake myself up before it came closer. This was the first time I saw her in the light, as, well, it wasn't a dark room, but a normal level of darkness. I could quickly see it was a lady shorter than me and appearing to be middle-aged. She had coarse-looking dark hair. She didn't wear your typical scary ghost clothes of flowing fabric or Victorian gown. She wore black slacks, clogs, and a purple turtleneck sweater. Her face was in the darkness as her head was tilted forward, her hair obscuring her face. I would only be assuming that she was looking at me, as her posture suggested she was staring downwards. I only lived in that rental property for 7 months before the lease expired, and outside the phantom music box and the one bad episode of sleep paralysis, I fortunately didn't have any other scary encounters at this residence. I have a friend who I met right before I turned 20 that I'm still friends with now, nearly 12 years later. My friend, called Amy, has a daughter called Sarah. Through our friendship, we shared 2 paranormal experiences together, one which was the precursor for the other. We were very close, codependent people, and my relationship with my significant other had become toxic as they were drinking to excess nearly daily. Being with Amy and Sarah was a safe haven for me, and they loved being there too. Amy and I were working at a non-profit location together, one that takes in donated items and puts those funds towards building homes for needy people. We had a customer who came there nearly daily looking for bits and pieces for his properties. He was an oddball, a hoarder, a slumlord, but mostly a nice guy. We had a good repertoire with him, and he mentioned to Amy about some tenants leaving a property he had nearby suddenly. Amy was desperately looking for somewhere for her and her daughter to go, since her current apartment had raised their rates exponentially. It was the bottom half of a duplex, he said. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a living room, eating kitchen, and a wraparound porch for $200 a month. I had by this time begun to hone my ability to sense haunted locations. Amy and I looked at the apartment, and my body immediately told me it was haunted. It was very rough and in a rough part of town, but it was massive and so inexpensive. Within a week, we were packing up her things and moving there. I couldn't come up with enough reasons for her not to move in that would have convinced her. We spent most of the hot days of summer repainting and decorating and making it look as nice as possible. We landscaped, caulked cracks, repaired broken windows, and fixed leaky plumbing. It ended up being a pretty cozy place, once a few weeks of elbow grease went into it. It was truly the perfect scenario for a single mum. I still had that deep unsettling feeling, but I was the only one who felt this way for quite some time. When the weather began to cool, it was as if the house came out of hibernation. I would often spend Saturday nights there in one of those spare bedrooms after watching movies and eating pizza with Amy and Sarah. Amy had begun to tell me about hearing strange creaks or footsteps in the house. This prompted us at the time to make sure the windows were more secure and added an additional deadbolt to both the front and back door. We made the logical conclusions at first, even though alarm bells were going off in my head, when the sounds of someone seemingly being in her home continued. She blocked off the back door and began pushing the couch in front of the front door at night. We placed a call to the landlord to check the upper levels as well, but he confirmed that the windows weren't broken in, and the door was locked. He replaced the lock up there as well, and said he didn't see any signs of squatters. One Saturday, while sitting in the living room, we both heard the unmistakable sound of someone walking. I recall we both turned in the same direction suddenly, and expectantly as we heard it approach us. She hushed me to make sure I'd heard it, and we sat holding our breath with the TV on mute. I got up as quietly as I could and walked through the lower level, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. Not above us, not outside, and not below us. It seemed to be someone pacing through the lower level. The minute you walked to where you heard it, it sounded now behind you, or in another room. It was an eerie game of hide and seek. I would trace it to the kitchen, pause and listen, and Amy would hear someone walking next to her. It was the soft sound of footsteps on carpet, with weight and creaking. It was not unlike hearing a mouse in a wall. The sound is there, though not tangible, and you can't see it. It resolved that night with us sleeping in the same room with the lamp on. The next thing we witnessed were the children's handprints all over the glass. It started with seeing some at the top of the bathroom mirror. I was in there after work, and while washing my hands I looked up and saw it. I rubbed it off with the hand towel, assuming Sarah must have stood on the sink and pressed her sweaty palms against the mirror. I didn't even mention it at the time because it seemed like a logical and sound explanation. Just later that evening, Amy had been looking out of the living room window and saw them all over the glass. Then we saw them where Sarah couldn't reach, from bottom to top. They weren't filled, but each window had about 6 or 7 handprints. When Amy went to wipe them, we realized they were all from the inside, so they weren't neighboring children. We compared them to all of ours, and they didn't match Amy's long, skinny hands, nor my wide palms and short-fingered hands, and they were too big to be Sarah's. That day we Windexed every window and mirror in the house, from outside as well, as far as I could reach. The next day at work she showed me pictures on her cell phone of the handprints in the bathroom mirror again. Now we had phantom heavy footsteps and childlike handprints throughout the duplex. Amy told me at work one weekday that her long-term significant other had spent the night and claimed to hear Amy speaking to Sarah. He was lying on the bed watching TV, and Amy was supposed to be in the shower and Sarah in bed, but he could clearly hear Sarah responding to a mature woman's voice. He paused the movie he had on and listened again. He could hear the shower running. He also knew it wasn't Amy. He quickly got up and walked through the house to see what was going on. He said in his gut he had an awful feeling that something simply wasn't right. It was only 15 steps from the bedroom door to the living room where he found Sarah sitting in the middle of the floor looking upwards and chatting with someone. She was about 4, so while she wasn't speaking fluently, she was still forming short sentences and answering in the affirmative or negative to questions being asked. She was pushing a toy truck back and forth on the plush carpet and smiled up at him when he turned on the overhead light. He asked who she was speaking to, and she pointed to the empty space beside her. He said it was as though someone was standing and she was looking at them from where she sat. He took Sarah back to the room with him, and she fell asleep in the bed quickly. When Amy came out, he explained to her, and she said that Sarah may have been half asleep, sleepwalking, or just playing make-believe. However, it was a few days later that Amy heard Sarah speaking with someone too. She couldn't hear the other person's voice, but could clearly hear the telltale inflection in her voice of her having a conversation, responding affirmatively or negatively, and pausing for responses. It definitely didn't seem malicious, but it was undoubtedly terrifying. Amy told me this too, and I suggested we bless her home with holy water and light a blessed candle. I didn't feel like saying I told you so, instead I felt dread and worry. She agreed, so after work a few days later, we went to her house and did just that. I had only just spent the night before looking at my phone as to what someone would do in this situation. It was about 8 years ago, and the internet had a lot less help than it does now. I went through each room, dousing it with holy water and saying St. Michael's prayer. My significant other was practicing the Jewish faith and had written down a similar banishment prayer she had gotten from her dad, which I said with a lit candle in each room as a step 2 in this process. We left it alone after, and the house seemed to fall into a quiet for the remainder of the season. It was the tail end of winter going into March, where the snow was grey and slushy, refreezing every night and melting again all day. It was early Sunday afternoon, and I had once again spent that Saturday night there. I was in the kitchen doing the dishes, and Amy decided to get us Arby's for lunch. Her curly red hair was in a floppy ponytail, and she was wearing her white puffy winter jacket. She left out the front door, as the back door was still blocked off, and it was only a short time later that I heard Sarah talking to someone and could hear a woman's voice. I turned the faucet off to hear clearly. I assumed Amy had just come back already or had turned around for some reason. I listened to her chatter for a few moments, and then I thought it was strange that Amy would be speaking so softly. I got this creepy crawling feeling up my spine while I finished the dishes, and then walked into the living room, drying my hands and looking expectantly, if not hopefully for Amy. but it was just Sarah sitting on the carpet, stacking her books and making her toys go over them. I asked her where her mum was and she pointed outside. I looked outside, but her car wasn't there, and realized Sarah had meant that Amy had left, which I knew. I peeked into Sarah's room and the other rooms, but ended up still being alone with Sarah. I went back to the kitchen to finish cleaning up, feeling unnerved but not wanting to seem upset to Sarah, and after only a minute of being out the room I could hear the woman's voice start back up. I froze in the doorway, and my hand grabbed the wet rag as I listened carefully. I stared out the window in front of the sink and watched the melting snow drip from the gutter. The voice was barely audible, sounding sweet and soft with a thick Hispanic accent. She asked Sarah what the toy was, and Sarah described it. Then she asked if she wanted to go now, and Sarah said not without her mum. Dear listener, I remember my heart pounding really hard in my throat and storming down the hall to the living room to confront whoever was going to take her. I saw the glimpse of the lady walking past the living room doorway, almost like Amy, about her height, as Amy was almost 6 feet tall, so hard to mistake, with a puffy white coat or perhaps a white, billowy blouse, but her hair was long and dark. In the 2 seconds it took me to get to the room, she was gone. The front door was still blocked off, so a human didn't exit that way. The only other exit was Sarah's room, which was empty. I even looked in her tiny closet despite knowing an adult couldn't fit there. I took Sarah into the kitchen with me and told her not to talk to that lady ever again, sprinkled holy water throughout the house that day too. The month of April was rainy, as it should be, heavy with thunderstorms. One day after work, we went back to Amy's house to find the power had gone out in the bedrooms, and Amy begged me to check the breaker in the basement. We had yet to go into the basement. The door was at the end of the hallway closest to the kitchen, but we often forgot the basement door was here, as it was small and slight, and Amy usually had the vacuum in front of it, and we had to really yank it open. It smelled bad, the way abandoned basements do. Amy and Sally stood at the top of the staircase, and Sally shouted random words of encouragement, saying, "Big thank you." The basement was massive, but so was the house. This was the type of big old house that was meant for a family of 6 or 7, and I'm sure 80 years ago it was stunning, but someone had made it into a duplex and it sat withering away in a low-income housing area until it was broken up and beaten down. The second thing I noticed about the basement was that it was absolutely packed full of old belongings. There were entire sets of furniture, boxes, bicycles, and appliances. I believe the landlord just put the old tenants' belongings down there instead of paying them to take them to the dump. I had to snake my way through, trying to locate the breaker box along the walls. Absolutely, of course, it was on the furthest away from the stairs, with a small rectangle of light coming through. On the way back, I had to step onto a wooden chair, slide over a washing machine, and kick my way through, pushing boxes and other items until I reached it. When I flipped the breakers and confirmed the power was back on, I could see from the angle that I had a better way through than what I chose to get through. From this viewpoint, I could also see beneath the basement steps, as there was a small alcove of space. I shone my light closer and saw there was a small white stand on the ground with some things on it. I shimmied over and saw it was a shrine. It was a wire stand with a candle and bowl of coins and some family photos lying around. Above it there were some dried herbs and flowers hanging from the top of the back of the stairs pointing towards the shrine. I told Amy about it later, and she agreed with me to take it down. So I found an empty box in the basement and we packed all of the items and brought it to the garbage outside. I'm not familiar with what religion it was that put the shrine there, but I had a few people suggest it was to honor a loved one who passed and to ensure their transition to the afterlife. I once again sprinkled holy water throughout the house and in the basement, and after doing this, the rest of April and beginning of May were peaceful in the house. We really felt that this was holding someone there, and we had released them. In retrospect, we may have been so convinced we did the right thing that we ignored the normal sounds of being haunted. Then one night Amy texted me that something scary had happened to her. She described that the candles in her bathroom had been thrown down the hallway and into the living room. The candles were a tall pillar candle that was sat on the side of the long vanity, and the vanity itself was behind the bathroom door. If the bathroom door was open, it blocked most of the sink, and the candles would have been behind that door, to the other side of the shower and the toilet. So the candles would have had to be moved around the door, throughout the doorway, down the next 3 or 4 feet of the hallway and into the living room. If you stood in this doorway of the bathroom and threw a candle forward, it would hit the hallway wall, so this somehow made it around the corner. I don't know what the focus of the living room was, but it was strong. She put the candles back and blessed it with holy water again, while repeating the prayers I had left. Over the next few weeks, she heard Sarah talking to this disembodied voice more and more. The conversation became more one-sided, as the voice seemed louder and more aggressive. Sometimes Amy would hear it speaking when Sarah wasn't there, especially if they were in the bedroom together. Amy also heard it ask Sarah if she was ready to leave, although it frequently spoke in Spanish, which, unfortunately, neither of us spoke. We became very afraid at this time, as Sarah was also starting to become upset. She would leave her own room to sleep in Amy's so much that Amy brought her toddler bed into her own room and left Sarah's room closed off at night. Amy told me about hearing someone pacing outside her bedroom door at night, hearing the floor creaking as if they'd paused, and she imagined them looking in at her. Amy left the lamps on in the living room and the range light on over the oven in the kitchen and the nightlight in the bathroom. Every night she blessed with holy water and said prayers out loud. We think this might have helped some. I like to imagine it kept things at bay, and I try not to imagine the alternative if we'd have done nothing. At work I had a customer come in who was looking for some material to build a shed outside for their intellectually disabled daughter to have her own safe space to go. I had spent about an hour helping him pick things out and gave him a really good deal on some material. He popped in and out over the next week, picking up different things, and on one occasion overheard our conversation where we were looking online at ways to do cleansing and what to use. When he came to pay, he said he lived on the reservation here and he would bring us back some supplies to cleanse her home. It was a few days later that I met him in the parking lot and paid for the supplies. He gave me a sage mixture to burn and had some other things in it like pine and tobacco and a stone to burn it on, and an eagle feather to waft the smoke. He had a small piece of paper with a prayer to recite and gave me some pointers. I was absolutely terrified. While this seemed a strange chance to meet with this man, I still communicate with him once in a while when we check in with one another on Facebook. In the in-between this time, Amy had gotten some small handheld recording devices. She attempted an EVP session a la Ghost Hunters but got nothing. We left the recorders going while we did the cleansing ritual and would check them the next day. We did the ritual after Sarah went to sleep, and I burned and wafted the sage while Amy recited the prayer. It was largely uneventful, with no poltergeist activity or chaos. In the bathroom, we heard what sounded like a deep guttural growl, but could absolutely have been a pipe gurgling. The next day we reviewed the tapes and only heard the usual sound, except in Sarah's room. As soon as we left from whispering the prayers, the recorder clicked off about 2 minutes after the doors closed. It didn't stay off, however. It started to record again early in the morning, and her toys were randomly going on and off. Sarah was sleeping in Amy's room, and I don't suspect that Sarah did this because we had it on top of her window where she couldn't reach. Even if she climbed and got it, I doubt she had the wherewithal at 4 to know when to turn it back on. We went back into a period of quiet in the house. But come July, Amy ended up moving back into her mother's basement. But it was mostly due to her landlord being pretty awful and the neighbor being rough. She ended up no longer being able to justify it and moved out. Sarah is 10 now and doesn't remember this house at all. Unfortunately, where I work now, I have to drive down the street adjacent to the street it's on, and I can always see it in my peripheral vision. It appears someone has been living there for quite some time, and I hope it is peaceful for them. I just know Amy was deeply unsettled by all the things she heard there, and the constant thought that something wanted to take her daughter away. We nearly never bring it up, as I think she likes it behind her. After the previous event at Amy's old location, I had done much more research into the idea of cleansing out spirits, and done the process on where I lived at the time, and a few other locations too. I had long discussions in paranormal threads and on Reddit. I had spoken to many people of different religions, but primarily those who practiced pagan ones. I ended up piecing together my own sort of process from different rituals. I had cherry-picked specific prayers that I liked, and different activities to form my own personal liturgy. These were different bits from different spiritual practices and religions. I had this theory that different spirits would react to different things, depending on their own personal beliefs. None of us can be sure what's out there in the afterlife, so I felt it best to cover all my bases. I had done this ritual in my own place, and had felt better. I had then done by request to a few different locations and received positive feedback. I don't actually know what happened with the hauntings, as I was not privy to what happened in them before I did the cleansing, only that they wanted one done. There were a few places I walked into that I sensed were haunted, and a few that I felt were absolutely fine. It was mostly co-workers or friends of a friend who had told them about their house being haunted, and them mentioning I might be able to help. This was the precursor to the secondary event that I experienced with Amy. She had told her family about what was going on during that time, and the following summer her sister had told Amy that she thought her son, Amy's nephew, was experiencing something paranormal. Amy asked me if I still had the sage and cleansing ritual, and if I could do their houses too. I had been to their house a number of times, Amy and I being as close as we were for so many years. They had a large garage where they set up tables and played card games, and had a fridge full of beer. I knew Amy's nephew, Roger. He was a good kid who was in the drama club and a good big brother. We watched his plays and had his 13th birthday at Amy's previous residence on the big porch. When I went to visit, I asked Roger what was going on, and he described the following. He said sometimes when he's in his room alone, he sees a dark figure from the corner of his eye. He hovers around, but when he looks at him in the face, he isn't there. He has all kinds of bad dreams about him, where he's chasing him down the school hallway or waiting outside his classroom doors. I asked him if he saw him anywhere else in the house. He told me he just stays in the basement with him. I asked if he went to the laundry room down there, and that no, and that he only steps around the bed or behind the TV. Though the worst thing he did was a few nights ago, when he thought he saw him running up the steps, and that he followed him all the way up. They had a nice finished basement, and what used to be a hangout area with a sofa and television was converted into his bedroom to get the new teenager his privacy. He had a bed, his dresser, a desk along with the previously mentioned furniture, on big area rugs with some nice tall floor lamps. On the other side of the basement there was the laundry room and a small half bathroom. I had the whole family outside, so I would be alone. I opened the windows upstairs first to give the entities a place to leave from, and I had never felt anything weird in the house. However, I had never gone downstairs into this room. When I descended the steps, I felt the immediate shift. Basements are always cooler, but this was shocking. I felt like I was walking right into a cold spot that enveloped me and followed me. His room was messy, with clothes on the floor and miscellaneous items that I had to tiptoe around. I started in the back corners, coming forward, as if I was sweeping a broom across the floor. In addition, I had holy water and blessed salt for the windows. I prayed longer around his bed, where he said he was having the nightmares. And during this, I kept having the urge to look behind me, where his dresser was up against a wall. I sprinkled that area liberally with holy water and continued the recital. I had found a pagan prayer that I referred that had a strong statement to make sure spirits know they weren't welcome in this location. I went through the whole basement and began going up the stairs, but still felt this nagging, like I forgot something. I bent down and looked in the room, my eyes scanning, and kept resting around his bed and dresser, but I didn't see anything. When first I sprinkled the holy water, I then walked through with sage, starting from the back of the house, towards the front of the house, as if again sweeping with a broom and pushing out the door. I recited the prayer over and over and then put a line of salt on the window before closing them one by one. As it was ending, I began to feel stuffy and lightheaded. I thought it was because I was breathing in the smoke from the sage and the massive temperature change I felt from downstairs to up. I had a small litany to the saints I wanted to say, so I set the sage away from me a bit and sat on the living room floor. Dear listener, the next feeling that I experienced was entirely new to me. I began to feel overwhelmed and dizzy. My eyes were heavy. I felt my entire body sweating and the air felt thick. I felt like I could hear static as if coming from the TV, but the screen remained black. Everything felt like it was much too warm and in slow motion. I began to hear a strong male voice clearly coming from the basement below me. I will give you nightmares. I listened as he repeated this once or twice and stood up, with great effort, and followed where the voice became louder. I felt afraid, but my gut instinct told me I had to go back down there one more time. I would never have forgiven myself for not doing the absolute most for this kid. Once again I was drawn behind his bed to the dresser against the wall. I began to have the sneaking suspicion there was something in here, maybe something of this ghost man or otherwise. I shuffled through the first drawer and didn't find anything that stood out to me, just unmatched socks and miscellaneous odd ends and loose batteries. The second was nearly empty, except for a few cards to some sort of anime show and a t-shirt. The third had a bunch of pajama pants folded nicely, so I assumed they were never used. I had 2 drawers left, so I was squatting down. It was in the second to last drawer, and I found it immediately. A folded Ouija board. It was out the box, just the folded cardboard, and I knew from when my fingers felt it and pulled it out. The heaviness and dread I felt greatly subsided with an aha moment. I rushed up the stairs and outside with it, and immediately asked Roger what he was doing with it. He went through a story of his friends and him doing it at the community theatre together, and he had to take it home so someone else wouldn't get in trouble. Amy took it and buried it far away from the house, and Roger said he felt better from there on out, and the nightmares subsided. I had a few bad dreams over the event, and often would hear the voice repeating in my head. I don't think anything followed me so much as this event simply unnerved and frightened me. I declined after to do this anymore. I only did it for my own personal use. Simply put, I was in my mid-20s and was tired of feeling frightened and wanted out of the paranormal world. So I began to do just that. I had at this time been invited to a paranormal enthusiasts group and left them as well. We had done a handful of ghost investigations during this time, and while they were mostly uneventful, they still frightened and exhausted me. I acknowledged I had a gift, and if I was so inclined, I knew I really could use it and do something more with it, but I didn't want to. I began to tune out the feeling told me if there was a ghost nearby, a sort of knocking I would get. I stopped volunteering stories to people or joining these sorts of conversations. The only thing that continued for me was the sleep paralysis and night terrors. I couldn't seem to make these go away fully, but as time went on I learned that these were not extremely or entirely supernatural, but instead were just a sleep disorder. And once I came to this understanding, I felt for a long time that I was truly free from it. The next part of my life was the biggest challenge from where I had been previously. At 26, I ended a long-term relationship with my ex that was incredibly tumultuous and moved out of the home we had been in for the last 2 years. I ended up living with the man who would become my husband in the house which I am currently still residing in. Since moving out of my parents, this was the longest I had been living in one residence, and I continue to suffer from sleep paralysis, and moving here didn't change this. For quite a while, it was nothing more than me waking and realizing I was in this state, suffering from the overwhelming feeling of dread, and then either waking up fully or falling back asleep. When my husband and I began to share a bed, he became fully aware of my weird sleep disorders. I'm an incredibly light sleeper. I'm awake at the slightest noise, and I have difficulty falling into a very deep sleep. I still often sleep talk and wake up feeling panicky like I've overslept or forgotten something. I'm always aware of him leaving or coming back to bed, or of the dogs coming and going. After I had been there for about a year, my sleep paralysis episodes began to escalate. She was the same woman I had seen before. Our upstairs is a large, open flat with a doorway separating the two areas. There is no door, however. One side has our clothing, dresses, my vanity, and the other side has our bed and nightstands. The bed faces the other room, so when you lay in bed you can stare down the other side, seeing the entire upstairs easily. She would usually stand in this area as far away as she could near the window on that wall. I was always aware that she was there, standing, watching. While it escalated, I did more and researched into sleep paralysis and spoke with plenty of people who had it to assure myself that it was just strange brain behavior and not at all paranormal, no matter how frightening it was. And it was frightening. I had so many episodes that left me shaking and in tears. I injured my back and for many months could only sleep lying flat on my back, which, you may know, is a massive trigger for sleep paralysis. It went from happening twice a month to 3 times a week. I was consistently exhausted as my periods of wakefulness increased in duration. What used to be an occurrence that lasted just a few minutes started upwards of 10 to 15. Then my calm down time would be significantly longer too. The worse the experience was, the longer I would sit in bed, trying to calm down and not feel afraid. For 6 years, my husband did overnight shift as a hotel supervisor, and that was the first 3 years of me living there. This meant that for 5 nights a week, I slept in the bed alone. In the light of day, I began to dread going to bed at night. I would be tiptoeing up the stairs, holding my breath. I'd look at my phone until my eyes couldn't stay open any longer, and I'd try to sleep. We tried to rectify some of the issues by getting me lots of little lights to avoid darkened areas in the room. We had strings of purple Halloween lights around the ceiling. The outlets in the baseboard had 2 night lights to illuminate the darkened footpaths. It was dim enough to sleep, but it kept me from waking in the dark. I felt like a silly child, but it was all becoming very necessary for me. Being able to see my surroundings clearly helped for quite some time with the sleep paralysis and kept it from turning into frightening scenarios. My husband witnessed the sleep paralysis a few times where he would be awake, cuddling with me while I slept, and feel my body going entirely rigid. He said my legs would stick straight out and be unmoving. Once he turned the light on and woke me up, saying I was staring at the ceiling with fluttering eyelids but not moving anywhere else. It shook him up, but he woke me up, and I was able to go back to sleep with him. There were a few times that the experiences would be so traumatizing that I would call into work the next morning and spend the day on the couch, feeling vulnerable and afraid. My sleep paralysis felt like a virus that became resistant to every cure. I attempted to curate against it. I would see the benefit for a bit, and the most difficult aspects would disappear. Then over time they'd wear off, and the awfulness would begin to increase once more. Throughout this, I was very aware of my sleep paralysis demon, the before-mentioned woman, and the sound she made. When we implemented the lights, she wouldn't appear. Even if I couldn't see her, I could hear her, walking, the heavy footsteps pacing around my bed, as if she invisibly circled me. I felt so vulnerable and frightened by her, and felt this overwhelming feeling of malice towards me. Just this bottomless pool that was full of vile wickedness. I have never felt it before nor since, that feeling of hatred and loathing. I've never felt it towards anyone, nor in any of my paranormal experience did I feel something so unkind to this extent. It was heavy and hung in the air. If I had to visualize it, it was murky and dark, like a swamp at night. Eventually the lights ceased to faze her, and she began to appear in my sleep paralysis once more. However, now she was fully illuminated and I could see her clearly. Our routine began to repeat as follows. I was awakened by the floor creaking and the sound of people walking. I opened my eyes and realized I couldn't move. I knew instantly what this was and tried not to panic. I began to breathe deeply and tried to calm myself. I close my eyes and attempt to fall back asleep, avoiding this event entirely, but it doesn't work, as I can hear that someone is walking around my bed. They're close to me, perhaps leaning over. There is hostility in the air, and tense, as if I was just walking around on a couple who are having a fight. I began to feel as if I'm in trouble, and afraid, like I've been caught doing something wrong and I'm about to pay dearly for it. Then I'd hear a wet, squelching sound, like someone stepping in mud. I wince and squeeze my eyes tighter. I focus on the feeling in my toes, my fingertips, and trying to move them. If I can break free out of this, it'll all go away. I hear footsteps as she's walking away and I open my eyes. They flutter across the small empty bedroom. I can see both dogs, one above the blanket and one beneath. My eyes strain to see across into the adjacent room, where I see her standing against the window. There is the top of the stairs to her right, and she keeps glancing towards it as if she's going to walk down. Instead, she walks towards me. Her head is hanging down, her arms are crossed. It's not a far walk, maybe 4 or 5 steps to get through the room, but she's walking slowly. I can feel hot tears streaming at the corners of my eyes, but I can't stop looking at her. I can hear my breath forcefully coming in and out my nose, unable to open my mouth. She makes it to the end of the bed and stops. She'll move as if she's about to get on the bed, and the fear propels me forward and I awaken fully, at which point I sit up and gasp for air. She's gone. I startle the dogs and the small one crawls out from under the blankets and they both look at me. I usually hold the smaller one and cry. Sometimes I will shakily go downstairs and attempt to sleep on the couch with the TV on. This was the way it went for approximately 15 months. I expressed it to some people but kept most of it to myself, unless speaking about it in online website threads with other people who have it. I found some coping mechanisms and tried new things that were suggested. I invested in taking upwards of 20 grams of melatonin at night, which would sometimes put me in deep enough sleep that I would be able to fall back asleep after the moment sleep paralysis happened. But more often than not, it made me feel highly lethargic the next day. When summer came, things escalated further. At this point, I began to acknowledge that this wasn't a standard sleep paralysis experience and was indeed paranormal in nature. I began to hear sounds of her when I was awake, and this brought on full panic. I felt like I was going crazy, and these were actual crazed hallucinations I was experiencing. I did the cleansing ritual I hadn't done in years and blessed my bedroom with holy water every night before I went to sleep. I even went so far as to get an entirely new bed with a new bed frame on the offhand that my bed was secretly haunted. This was something else she would become resistant to, as she began to feel more and more tangible. I felt as though I had no escape from her. At times during the day while making dinner, I would hear telltale wet sounds. They would make my stomach drop, and I would frantically look around as if she were right behind me. My husband changed his job and began to work mornings now, and was now in bed with me every night. My sleep paralysis lessened during the night, and I was having more daytime activity. I recall once I was cutting vegetables up in my kitchen listening to a podcast, and I felt my hair get yanked forcefully from behind. It was firm enough that my head jerked back and I dropped the knife. There was never any sign of anyone being in there despite how physical the interaction was. I would hear the upstairs floor creak as if someone was walking there, and would also find it empty. One hot, sticky July morning, everything came to an abrupt head. I wasn't to be at work until 2 p.m. that day, so I had intended to stay in bed late. I hadn't had an episode the night before and was lumping in bed looking at my phone. At some point around 10 a.m., I fell into a light sleep, lying across my bed on my side. I recall having an incredibly vivid dream at this time. They weren't necessarily nightmares, but they were all very unsettling. I was awoken by the feeling of something moving beneath me. This brings me fully awake now, and I attempt to sit up, but I find I'm in a state of paralysis. I take this moment to try and fall back asleep, which sometimes helps. I fall back asleep for a few moments, immediately going into the dream, in which I'm swimming in dark water at night. I don't feel afraid. I'm awoken again, and it occurs to me that my bed is physically moving. It is as if someone is under the bed, trying to shove it up off them in some way. My room is bright with light, and I can see my alarm clock from the corner of my eye and can easily read the time, so I know I'm not in a dream state, as it's 10:25 a.m. I'm awake fully and able to move out of sleep paralysis. I sit up and look around, but I also feel exhausted as if I've been drugged. My eyes are incredibly heavy, and I lay back down on my back, pulling the covers over me and fall asleep instantly. I sleep as though I'm aware I'm asleep. I feel aware of the darkness over me. I feel as if I'm a small creature, inside my body, awake while my body slumbers. I once again feel the movement of the bed. My body rocks as if on a boat, increasing with intensity until my eyes open and I'm brought back to my bedroom. It is light, it is daytime again, and the heavy feeling is still there. But I know I need to get up. I realize my body is stuck in sleep paralysis still. Or again. Have you ever had to hold your breath a moment longer than you could? That's the same panicky feeling I had. My brain was screaming danger, but the relief of gasping for air wasn't to come. I feel the room fill with the feeling of hatred she has. I cannot describe it other than a near tangible substance, like the way heat hovers above pavement. This substance was to air that oil is to water. I look towards the other end of the room and don't see her by the window, but while I'm looking forward I begin to see a shape form at the end of the bed. I realize that someone is crawling out from under the bed. The top of their head, their shoulders, their back, crawling on all fours, and I feel the pressure in my head and throat building from my attempts to scream or yell. She crawls sluggishly across the room to the window. She puts her hand on the ledge and pulls herself to her feet. For about a minute she stands still, her back to me, as if looking out the window. It feels so much longer than I know it is. The emotion she radiates feels thick like humidity and I'm breathing it in. I feel so small and vulnerable. I remember briefly being thankful I had pulled the covers over me, as if that was some protection at all. She turns to her left towards the steps, then she looks over to me, and for the first time I see her face in full light. She then begins to go down the steps. I can hear her footsteps descending further below me. I exhale hard through my nose and blink the blurriness of tears away and look around, trying to wake myself up. My eyes peer over, and I see my alarm. It's 10:27. I'm not dreaming. This is slowly happening in real time. Let me take this moment to describe her face and her full appearance once more. You have undoubtedly formed a visual of her and what you find frightening. She is of average height and weight and has the softness that a woman tends to get in her 50s. She's in a black dress, wearing slacks and clogs, the Dansko support kind that nurses may wear. She has a turtleneck sweater that is a dark purple and looks a bit stretchy. Her hair grazes the top of her shoulders and is black and wiry. She isn't a floating spectre in a Victorian-age wedding gown or some other ethereal ghostly vision. There is nothing innately horrifying about her. That is, until this day, when I saw her face fully for the first time. Her features lead me to think she might be Hispanic or indigenous. It's hard to tell exactly, as her entire bottom jaw was missing.
Below her philtrum where lips should appear, the flesh seems torn, her front teeth exposed. Beneath this is a gaping hole of carnage, where her thick, meaty tongue lies exposed. Beneath me, in the world that is my main floor, I can hear her moving about. She seems to be throwing objects. I hear thuds and glass shattering, the distinct sound of someone rummaging around. Occasionally I hear a loud, frustrated growl sound. I hear heavy footsteps from her, as if she's pacing from the kitchen to the living room and back again. My dogs still lie asleep, unmoving beside me, unaware, as of yet, there is an intruder in our home. I'm attempting to desperately wake myself up, wiggling fingers, wiggling my toes, closing my eyes, and breathing to try and remain calm. But I cannot get this to pass. I glance over at the clock again, my eyes the only part of me that can move. 10:34 a.m. I've already been in for almost 10 minutes. I hear her approach the bottom of the steps, the creaking sound I know too well. It's a silent moment before I hear the fast thudding of footsteps suddenly as she comes running up the stairs. My head aches with how hard my heart is pounding. She paces around the bed furiously, her arms folded while she stares down at me, round one side to the other. I hear the rapid intake of air in her grotesque mouth hole as she pants with anger and seethes with rage. I realize with a nauseating roll of my stomach that the gurgling I've been hearing comes from her mouth. The sound of her breathing inwards, the hideous raw hole passing through. She finally goes to my side and stays. She physically puts a hand on the mattress by my head, and I can feel the indentation of her weight as it sinks down. The wet squelching sound I've heard for so many months is loud in my ear. She stays there a moment, just hovering over me. I look away as best I could. I know she was trying to intimidate me, and it's working. Her hair is near my face, and as I rapidly breathe through my nose, I inhale her scent, unintentionally, and cringe further. It's the smell of meat that's been out too long, or raw chicken, but an underlying smell of dark chocolate. So dark it's bitter. I realize these are the exact sounds and feelings I've had so many times in sleep paralysis. But she's here, fully visible now. I can see what she was doing on so many nights when I simply heard her move about. When she doesn't leave, I squeeze my eyes closed and begin to pray in my head. A cleansing prayer, muddled throughout with every prayer I learnt as a child and repeating, "Please God, please God, please God," over and over, unable to finish a single thought or prayer clearer than my own thought. I hear a voice that is both shrill and raspy.
"What are they?"
I open my eyes briefly, for some reason thinking that someone else asked that. But I still see her leaning over me. I close my eyes, hear her again, realizing that she's asking me in my head. This isn't a sound happening out loud. "Where are they?" Her voice was shrill, but somehow booming too. I think back at her without intention, but as a natural, of course, and ask, "Who? I don't know who you're looking for. I don't know." My thoughts are jumbled together. She slaps her hand on the mattress and I flinch when I felt her stand up. I felt the pressure of her knee on the bed, as if she was going to crawl on top of me. She got so she could straddle me, her hands on either side of my head. However, she must have nudged the sleeping dog under the blanket, as it woke up at that moment and started to bark instantly. Then both dogs jolted out of the bed, which woke me up fully, and I felt the release of sleep paralysis. In one swift motion, I opened my eyes, gasping for air, grabbed my phone, my hand slamming against the nightstand as I did so, and throwing myself out of bed, following my dogs as they went running. Halfway through, I collapsed on my steps and called my mother, hysterically crying. It was 10:57 when I called her. While on the phone, I could hear the dogs barking and running through the house. I told my mum everything that happened, just sobbing and gasping for air. My body ached so badly, as if I had been planking for the last 35 minutes. It was the longest time I had been in sleep paralysis before. I kept my mother on the phone as I went down the steps and searched my house for her. My first observation was the house was exactly how I left it. My dog stopped barking just moments after they'd gone down, but the larger of the two had his mohawk up still on wind a bit, pacing. The smaller one still sat on the ground. ears perked upwards. This demeanor lasted for them quite some time, as they both stayed on the edge for most of the afternoon. My mother and father came over that day a few hours after the phone call. I was still in my nightshirt and underwear, refusing to go to my upstairs bedroom and get dressed when alone. My dad went through the whole house, checked my windows and the doors for signs of an actual intruder. My husband came home while they were there. He opened the door slowly and asked me what was going on. I cried again, and Mum had to explain. Dear listener, my husband is the best person I know. His love for me is a deep sapphire ocean that I could sink into, full of warm waves and serenity. He is patient and he thinks before he speaks. He holds my face in his warm hands and kisses my forehead every day. But he simply does not fully believe in the paranormal. He thinks that it exists, but that no one could be experiencing it at the rate or intensity that people claim. He is a see it to believe it person. While he doesn't believe I'm lying, he feels that logically I have somehow become confused, or that it was simply a horrific nightmare. When I tell him past stories, as you have heard now, he believes that my desire for the experience embellished what happened. I don't hold this against him, although it frustrates me. In fact, his dismissal of supernatural activity has led me to let things go that I have felt were paranormal and not let it get under my skin. Needless to say, he didn't fully believe that a demon woman punched her way from my dream world into reality and terrorized me for half an hour. The destruction I heard hadn't actually left any damage done. What he did believe, though, was that I was terrified and in distress, and I remember sitting in our big sofa next to my dad, leaning into his arms while my eyes pleaded with my husband that were exchanged wordlessly between one another. He didn't object to anything I had to do next to feel safe. My father put blessed oil on every window and every door. We prayed the rosary, said the exorcism prayer. We put a line of salt in front of the exterior doors and the bedroom door. We laid a crucifix underneath the bed and placed holy candles throughout the house that I would burn while home nearly every day. My father buried St. Benedict's medals on each of the four corners of my house, on the outside dirt. I had a rosemary in my bedpost and holy water right next to my bed. If anything was going to make me feel safe to ward off something demonic, this had to be it. From then, my routine changed. The first few nights I didn't go anywhere in the house alone. I bathed with the door open and slept with the nightstand lights on. Every day when I got ready for work, sitting at my vanity, I lit my holy candle and let it burn the whole time. Then every night before bed, I blessed the house with holy water. I found a recording of a priest praying the St. Michael's prayer on YouTube that I would play with the volume turned up all the way whenever I was home, doing dishes, taking a bath, so that it was constantly being said, warding her off. I did not relent for at least 3 or 4 weeks of this. During this time, I had persistent nightmares and a few episodes of sleep paralysis. I didn't see her. I don't know if she was the direct cause of the nightmares, or if this was secondary to being traumatized. I told my immediate family at this time, but recounting it was exhausting. Mary told me that Mum had told her about it before I could, but had preceded the conversation that she had a dream about me the night before. She dreamt she was standing on a pier and I was under the water. Across the water, a woman was standing, but walking into the water. She didn't recall much at the time. I hadn't mentioned my intermittent dreaming that morning of me being in water, and still had yet to disclose this. I was willing to let it become another part of the mystery and let it go. I continued the routine I had for many weeks, slowly letting go of one ritual here or there. She faded away for most of the autumn and winter, but I had an experience with her in January where I saw her in the alcove of my front door. I was exiting the kitchen, walking towards the living room where the front door is adjacent, when I saw her movement. I stopped in the middle of the dining room and stared harder, waiting to see if I saw what I thought I saw. I did. She was in that alcove, not fully opaque. She seemed to be moving around a bit, as I could see her shadow on the wall and the bits of body that poked out from the wall. It's a small space, so I'm not sure what she was doing. I pictured a video game character glitching in rapid movement, jumbling around, and I felt brave for one moment and walked closer, and she was gone. It seems a bit on the nose, but it truly felt like she was trying to enter the house, and unable to. At the beginning of the new year, I had started a new job, and I became friends with one of my co-workers called Daniel. And over time, he began to tell me about his second job, which was that of a professional tarot reader, and his wife a psychic medium. He also had psychic abilities, but was just tuning into them with the help of his wife, who was very gifted. They also both practiced witchcraft and had done for many years. We worked together in an old hospital building, which was made into a psychiatric medical institution for children. We conversed over how haunted the building felt and the experiences we were having there, which made both of us comfortable in one another as far as discussing the paranormal. One day in spring, he had stopped by my desk on his way out to take a smoke break, and we were chatting. He mentioned he was doing a big gig after work, a house cleansing for a large family, and the mixed emotions he had going into it. He mentioned he had been doing a lot of cleansings lately and was getting burnt out. I shared that I knew how exhausting it could be and hadn't in fact done my own home in a while, and if I were to have it done again, I wouldn't be the one doing it. He asked me why I would need to ever have it done. I felt flustered for a moment, not wanting to divulge too much, and told him I had a pesky entity I liked to make sure I kept away. He then asked me, "Is it the lady that follows you around?" My stomach dropped, and goosebumps covered my body. He nodded with his head towards the small storage space behind me and said, "She's over there." I spun around to look but couldn't see her. I looked at him in shock and asked him what he meant. He proceeded to tell me the following. "When we were first speaking, I saw her round you. I thought she was something that haunted the building, and I paid her no mind, being in an old hospital. I have encountered a lot of residential spirits still lingering and afraid to move on. However, when you were walking down the halls, I saw her follow you closely. You were outside the building, and she was with you. I realized it wasn't the building she was haunting, but you." He had been waiting to ask me about it, and said she hovered closely when he spoke to me. I told him my story, while dry-mouthed and having a hard time getting the words out. I don't know why it made me so nervous to tell him. I think I felt vulnerable. I had told one of my really lovely dear friends one night when she had taken me home from my old job. We sat in my driveway and I word vomited it out. It was shortly after the incident, and she had noticed I wasn't myself at work for a few days. Don't you love women? Daniel went to the storage space and tried to confront her, telling her she wasn't welcome and to get away from me. He said she snarled and sneered but didn't speak, and that he'd be back with some ideas soon. And he really did. He did 2 spells and gave me a pouch of blended herbs and other earthy bits to carry around with me at all times. He then made a large potion that he added to mop water and cleaned the storage space floor with it, so she couldn't hover behind me there. Essentially, he was trying to cast her away from me and keep her from being able to stick somewhere. He gave me the same potion to spray in a bottle, and I sprayed my house thoroughly, especially the bedroom. This seemed to keep her further from me, but not away. He said that we two were at either end of a rubber band. Wherever I went, she followed, but from a further distance. He also suggested that perhaps the reason I didn't experience her at all my locations was because it took a certain amount of time for her to find me when I moved. When I first moved out of my parents' house, I lived in 4 places before I ended up living with my husband in about 7 years. I'm not certain on what the specifics were, as I couldn't ask her, nor would I if I could have. But by this logic, it took her a bit to rubber band back to me when I moved out. I don't understand how she followed me. I think it has something to do with the "where are they" that she was asking me about. Something went missing. Again, dear listener, it's a puzzle with a lot of broken pieces, and I'm not sure I can piece it all together. While I practiced getting distance between her and I, he said he did some spell work on his own at home. He tried to pull her away from me and create a barrier but was unsuccessful. However, he heard her in her head and said her voice was shrill and loud. This wasn't the description I'd give of the voice when she was a physical entity in my home, but I can't say it wasn't her altogether. Daniel suggested his wife come in and see what she thought, and I agreed. Her name was Mercy, and she came in during the mid-morning hours to drop something off for Daniel and to speak with me. I knew it was her the moment the front doors opened. Despite the constant flow of clients, I made eye contact with her, and she smiled brightly, a warm smile. She looked and smelt like she had been outside for hours, in the most pleasant way, and shook my hand with confidence. She nodded just behind me and asked, "Is that her?" Which I said yes, or it was. I assumed it was, as I couldn't see what they were in fact seeing. In fact, during this time I couldn't even feel her the way I'd felt her before. If they hadn't told me she was near, I honestly wouldn't have noticed. I felt overall very safe. She showed me the goosebumps she instantly got when we started to speak, her bare arms covered in them. Mercy asked me a few questions, but her eyes were all over the place, looking behind me and around me. She gave me her card and told me to call her if anything happened. She said, "If you have another sleep paralysis, call me. If you have a nightmare, call me. If you see her at all, call me. I'll be right here." By the time she left, she seemed to have pulled within herself and seemed more somber than Daniel did about it. But Daniel was a laid-back nomad type, always in torn jeans and a bandana, and walked into the room ready to be the main character. Daniel told me that Mercy and himself performed some rituals at home. I'm not sure what they were. I assumed they did some readings. He said Mercy had some violent visions during it, depicting this entity that was following me. He relayed her vision in the following. There's a small house atop a hill. All around it are empty fields and in the distance fire. I hear someone running, and I know they're afraid, but I can't see what's chasing them. She runs right past me, towards the house. The thing taking her is dark, and it swarms her until she falls to the ground. It's attacking her, and she's yelling to the house. The house becomes engulfed in flames, and she's left to watch, paralyzed on the ground. Mercy felt certain she was witnessing something that had happened to this entity and her family, some sort of attack. She felt it happen a long time ago, and that she witnessed her house burn down with her family inside. She suspected that she was unable to pass on, or as she attempted to find her family, where are they, referring to people, not an item. Daniel explained that when people stay in the in-between for too long, they lose who they are. If they pass without negative feelings or energies, those are expanded the longer they're left there, until the feeling is all they are. He said the more wicked they are, the worse they become, using the words human demon to describe some. He felt this might be the case since I felt so much danger and malice from her. I definitely believed in the description Daniel gave me, as I felt that perhaps she had lost herself to this feeling of loss and wickedness and was left as half a person. However, I wasn't quite sure of the timeline that Mercy felt she saw. She spoke that the image felt like a settlement, perhaps the woman was indigenous. I couldn't quite agree that she was this being from a few hundred years ago. As I've stated before, she wore slacks, a turtleneck sweater and clogs. I couldn't imagine these clothes being worn by anyone before the 1970s. In fact, it had a distinct 80s feel to it. I didn't feel like it had a specific conclusion with this, except to say that Mercy felt her, and I had familial connections. I felt that we did too. I imagined the house she saw on the hill was my grandmother's, and this being surrounded from there and connected to me. Perhaps she was a friend of my grandmother's, and this attack was a possession. When she passed away, she stayed there. This is where the other spirits had possessed her. And to the where are they question, my gut instinct led me to believe it was a physical item. I feel this as she was heard destroying my house, and I felt it was because she was searching for something, not someone. Daniel prepared a bag of items he said might help me with permanently getting rid of her. There was a different type of potion to spray around, specific incenses and colored candles to burn at the bottom. Wrapped in tissue paper was one side of what I assumed to be a baby deer jaw. He said to sleep with it beside me on my nightstand for a few weeks, then under the bed, and then I should be able to put it away. I didn't practice magic, dear listener, so if you're aware of what this spell is or was and why bones were used, let me know. In the in-between of the events described here, Daniel was insistent that when we spoke, I tried to communicate with her in some fashion and get a clearer idea of who or what she was. I had tarot cards that I used on my own for years, and he suggested I use this. He offered to do it together as a seance. I declined all of this, as I felt strongly that my reaching out to her would show some form of acceptance or invitation. He felt that if we opened communication, I could explain that I was afraid, unhappy, and unwilling to help or associate with her. I cannot again further describe the intensity of the malice, spite, hostility, and enmity she radiated towards me. I know people would describe a state of sleep paralysis as the beginning of feeling fear or in danger somehow. My feelings during sleep paralysis with her were feelings of being loathed. Never before had I felt this from anyone or anything. I was sure she knew she wasn't wanted and unwelcome. Furthermore, I was simply afraid of her. I felt she was dangerous to me in some way. My personal gut instinct was to choose flight in this situation. In discussion with a friend who was very much into the paranormal, they had suggested that perhaps she was using my sleeping states as a way to communicate with me already. I have always had a number of sleep irregularities. Mum said I was a child who could never take naps or I would be up all night. My older siblings would lie down for theirs, and she'd have to keep me preoccupied. I recall telling my mum in bed that I would just have the feeling again in which I wouldn't be able to sleep. The feeling wasn't just wakefulness or knowing I wasn't ready for bed, but a daunting feeling, perhaps foreboding, and I would be awake for most of the night. I remember many nights being awake until my parents went to bed, many hours later. Hearing their footsteps and the sound of their big waterbed as they got into bed. I've always had vivid dreams, primarily dreams that range from unsettling to nightmares and some night terrors. As mentioned previously, I frequently woke my sister up and had nightmares to share my bed, and she recalls waking me up when I was becoming too enraged in a dream and would be sounding aggressive. I still have dreams that I recall from childhood that terrified me and stuck with me, and dreams I dreamt over and over again. Even though I've lived most of my life not in our old house, my dreams consistently feature that house as a place of residence. For example, I recently dreamed we had an intruder in my house that my husband lives in. When I went down the stairs to escape, I was in the kitchen of our old house. I can't say all, but most houses in my dreams end up being our old house. Regularly, I've woken up to the sound of my own gasps in between sobs, as I've awoken wailing and sobbing. I will only recall small pieces of the dream, usually featuring me or what I perceive to be me, being separated by someone I love, or left in a purgatory-like state. In these dreams, I am in a deep grey box unable to reach the top, but knowing out there in my unreachable space is someone I love. The aching and loss I feel is so intense that my dream sobs awaken me, and I'm left with this feeling of malice. I've yet known to sleepwalk, but I have frequently spoken in my sleep. My husband recalls having small senseless conversations with me in my sleep that I am unaware of. Because I'm a light sleeper, sometimes my own talking or mumbling will wake me. My husband recalls once when he was just lying in bed looking at his phone, when he heard me murmur, "He was here." He asks me who it was, and I say the man outside our bedroom window, which was on the second story.
It spooked him enough that he woke me up fully to ask who I was talking to, but I couldn't recall what the dream was. He still made sure our doors were all locked and felt uneasy for the rest of the night. We've of course discussed sleep paralysis. This will range from mild, being able to fall back asleep and remove myself from the situation, to severe, usually just a full body apparition, the above stated scenario being the exception. I don't recall this in my youth, though I may have experienced it unknowingly and assumed it was a nightmare. I primarily recall it initiating at Grandma's house when I was 15, so a regular experience for the past 17 years. I've also had exploding head syndrome, or EHS, frequently. This is when, in the initial stages of falling asleep, you hear a loud explosion and it startles you awake. I would hear this and jolt upright, terrified because it sounded as if a bomb went off. I used to feel an intense bolt of lightning down my entire body, just as I'd fall asleep as well. While not exactly the same thing, I feel like it falls under the same misfired synapses. I'd also experience restless leg syndrome, so while I'm able to bypass a lot of these other symptoms with a sleeping aid, it always exasperates the RLS. This is, except for melatonin, but I will need between 20 to 30 milligrams for it to put me into a deep sleep. What I'm saying is, I am never without some continued sleep disruption, and I feel I spend most of my sleep alternating between the first two steps of N1 and N2. I'm unsure if some of these sleep disruptions are not in fact caused by something attempting to reach me in my sleep as previously suggested, or at the very least I feel like I'm frequently in a stage of sleep where I have just enough brain activity to register if something were trying to and perhaps respond. The idea of this has left me feeling incredibly vulnerable and even pangs of occasional guilt. Is there a chance I brought this on myself? As I touched on briefly before, I currently work at a psychiatric medical institution for children as the school secretary. The hospital was built in the fall of 1890, over 130 years ago. We've used it as the PMIC facility for the past 21 years. There is Building A and Building B. Building B is uninhabitable, but we're a non-profit so they can't afford to tear it down. Access to it is blocked off, but it still leers at you in the parking lot. There are many broken windows on the 6th floor of this building, and when the sun catches it just right, you can see into the empty hospital rooms. In fact, all of the old offices are just hospital rooms. Our floor signs, exit signs, majority of the wallpaper, paint, etc. are what they had 30 to 40 years ago in this hospital. I sat in what was the old emergency room entryway, where you'd check in with the nurse. You now check in with me. The garage was where the ambulances were parked. It's only behind my storage room. The cafeteria is on the ground floor, using the old morgue as a large freezer. The building is definitely on the eerie side at night, but during the day is filled with the voices of children and staff. The halls are lined with art projects like normal schools may have. The wings of the building that house their bedrooms are much warmer and cozier. Waiting rooms are now lounge areas with big TVs, boxes of games and toys, overstuffed sofas. The old nurses' stations are now used for staff to watch cameras, make phone calls, and do paperwork. However, we still only occupy about 80% of the building, maybe slightly less. Our ground floor has 3 separate schools in it, along with the rooms schools need, like the principal's office and cafeteria. The first floor has our outpatient services and residential therapists' offices, as well as a nurse and nurses' station. The second floor has only maintenance offices and my private office, both of which are down the same wing. The other 3 wings are empty, locked behind big double doors. The third floor has all of the admin offices in it. Fourth floor has a gym, art, horticulture, and home ec rooms for the residential units. The 5th floor is entirely empty. The 6th floor has all of the residential units on it, as well as their recreational areas. The 5th floor originally was full of units as well, but the mental health crisis continues in America,
unless Alliance Insurance is willing to cover the PMIC program. Where we once housed approximately 75 kids in our care, we now tend to have less than 30 at any given time. They will oftentimes be denied coverage while in our care, terminating the program. Dear listener, this is part of the mental health crisis most people don't realize. Mentally unwell children grow into mentally unwell adults unless intervention is had. We have had some extraordinarily troubling cases with children who fit the exact criteria for someone who will grow into a sociopath. If you're a fan of true crime, you know the normal ways someone may introduce the killer's backstory. Parents who came from a broken home, who had a child when they were underage, who perpetuated violence, neglect, and other things in their home. They raise a child who hurts others, starts fires, steals from people, and graduates into molestation and kills animals. These are the children we frequently have in our program, while we try to reverse years of abuse, treat PTSD, and give coping mechanisms for anxiety and medicate depression, or any number of ways we can attempt to make this child into a human that doesn't want to hurt others. Some children are too far gone. We know we can't salvage most of their humanity, and after 2 years in our care, insurance will say they've reached their peak and terminate it. They'll go back into the system where the abuse is undoubtedly picked back up. I hope you now understand that this building, while crumbling, vast and half unused, is not just eerie, with its dark corridors, flickering lights, and stale, white, empty hospital rooms, but also full of anger, bitterness, confusion, and wickedness of these children's energy. It is absolutely a surefire way to have the building become haunted or obsessed. During a normal day among many of our normal days, Daniel had found the old chapel at some point. He had planned to go investigate further and invited me to join, but I declined. Daniel described the chapel as destroyed with broken marble statues everywhere. It was small, but it was probably quite pretty at one time. I don't know how Daniel unlocked the door to it, but he partook in a lot of swashbuckling, so it makes sense he was able to. I recall his initial reaction when he told me about it, and him joking about taking the marble home in order for it to become recycled. But there was no inconspicuous way to remove giant slabs of marble. He had returned a few weeks later to investigate further, and then I'm sure work avoided and then came to relay his findings to me. This time Dee seemed upset and preoccupied, not staying long. What had initially been excitement, adventure, and curiosity quickly turned into worry and fear. Daniel stated he began to feel what he interpreted as a large dark mass hovering in there, as if suspended in the air. The longer he stayed in the room, the more intensely he could feel it. He felt it best for him not to return, so he doubled down on the locking efforts and practiced a binding spell on the entity. In the hurly-burly of what was our normal work environment, I entirely forgot about this whole ordeal. We were usually the first two at work, with him being there long before I, and he had rushed up to tell me the news the minute I was in my little room. It wasn't until Daniel told me that the chapel had been broken into, that the entity was gone, that I even remembered any of our conversations about it. He stated he had nightmares and visions about it while at home, and when he got to work, he immediately went to go check the chapel. I wasn't sure what to conclude from this, and neither was Daniel. It was very shortly after that we had a rapid-fire string of incredibly negative events at work concerning our clients, specifically the girls' unit. It's not uncommon to have a lot of extreme behaviors at a psychiatric unit, but the quantity of events in this short time was alarming to everyone. We had multiple girls attempt to take their lives. We had violent fights break out so frequently that most of the girls were put into peer separation. They would attack each other in the cafeteria in the middle of the night while waiting in line, or they would lunge over their school desks. They tried to elope daily, with one client going through the back exit down the fire escape and setting off the alarm, and when staff came up the stairs towards her, she pushed them down the steps, and that staff member ended up being very badly hurt, I believe causing a severe injury to her knee. The girls' unit caused massive property damage, with many broken windows throughout the building, one managing to pull the sink out of the wall, and many punching holes in the walls and damaging ceiling tiles.
We nearly always had a girl in the seclusion unit, or someone was being held in a restraining hold to keep them from harming someone else. Their bedrooms have been stripped of everything but their mattress, pillow, and blanket. Usually the clients' rooms had pictures on the walls, perhaps a bookshelf or a desk, some collapsible fabric containers for miscellaneous items. This all happened over the span of less than 2 weeks, with multiple events occurring every day, frequently overlapping, and this amount of activity is enough for us to have spread out over at least 6 months. Our staff were burnt out, many with injuries, and confused as to what was happening. This set many of the girls back massively in the program too. I was left with filing the paperwork that occurred, which was heaps due to all the extensive documentation that every incident requires. While filing it away, I came across an existing piece of paper in one of the girls' folder where the staff had said she had eloped in the middle of the night with a few other girls, and they wandered the building. It stated they confessed to breaking into the chapel that they found and planned to make it their hideout. They were found pretty quickly. I want to explain what eloping is. This is when a client manages to successfully leave their designated area, such as their floor or building. They can do this while staff is preoccupied with another issue with a client, or they themselves force an interaction with staff and break free/escape staff. Usually they only just manage within the confines of the building, often just the same floor, and staff can get them very quickly. It rarely occurs that they manage to escape the building entirely, and if they do, they usually then panic and don't leave the immediate premises, being seen quickly in the tall lights. If you're wondering how this happens, I will ask you, dear listener, if you've ever had to give a large dog a bath that did not want to take it. The same way you may fight to keep it in the tub, it's not unlike the way staff might fight against clients to keep them in an area that's safe, except these clients have thumbs to their advantage. The next time I had spoken to Daniel after the papers, I mentioned to him that shortly before our especially tumultuous week at work, the girls' unit had escaped to the chapel, and that was likely who had left the door open. There wasn't much we could do about any of it, but Daniel kept his work area safe, as did I. It eventually seemed to burn itself down and focused primarily on one client. She seemed to be the root cause for a lot of the incidents, or the antagonist. It was easy to see she was visibly weighed down. She hunched over, pulled her hoodie over her head, and just completely withdrew into herself. She became impossible for staff to control, until she was assigned her own worker nearly every day for intensive monitoring. During an overnight shift, she caused a massive commotion, destroyed property, and managed to evade the staff in the building for most of the night until she was able to escape out the front lobby doors, which do not have an alarm and only lock to keep people out, not people in. When she got loose, she ran far away, and the staff had to file a missing persons report. She was a ward of the state, so the only other person we could inform was her DHS worker. She apparently managed to hitch a ride and got about 2 hours from us before she was found a few days later. I took the call from the police officer that day, who introduced himself to the state he was from. He asked if we were missing a child and gave us her name, which was a false name, but closely related. i.e., if she said her name was orange, it was actually red. I asked him for a physical description, and he described her as small and mousy with the absolute deadest eyes you've ever seen, which was very specific and accurate. When she returned, she was strip searched, not as evasive as a cavity search, but still though, for weapons, and was found to have a large wad of cash with her and new self-harming scars. I only assumed the former was obtained in an unsavory way, with the latter being a secondary reaction. She didn't stay with us for much longer before the state transferred her into a locked facility. Think cliché institution, where I expect she still resides. I feel in my gut that this entity took complete advantage of her incredibly volatile and vulnerable existence and fed off her. I think there are entities here that specifically feed off what these children have gone through. I think there is a correlation between the evilness that causes mankind to perpetuate violence and the evil that feeds off the outcome of it. It's not something I think we could fully get rid of, as they come and go so frequently. We also have a mimic in our lobby, who can only repeat the words and phrases that have been said.
and it seems to use the ones recently used. I've greeted people, and after they've been let through the doors, I'll hear my words softly echo somewhere around a corner or just in front of me. "Have a good day," is commonly heard. This isn't an exact echo, as it happens often many minutes later. My husband has come to pick me up for lunch, and after I went into the bathroom, he heard me say his name while he sat and waited in the lobby. I remember coming out to tell him I was ready now, and his face being really pale and confused. The mimic doesn't seem to travel the building but stays in the lobby. I've never heard it speak to me more than 3 times a day, and often go weeks without it. It's not a bother either, but it's definitely eerie. I spend most of my time in my booth alone. As stated, there is a storage space behind me, and I will frequently hear the filing cabinets open and the sounds of papers rustling. Things often fall down or off shelves or just fall over, and I will come in the morning to see my jars of pens tipped over, a book fallen to the floor off the shelf, and so forth. I've regularly seen a large dark mass-like swarm the floor, like a cat darting across an area. It's passed beside me many times where I've turned and almost stepped on it, only to have it slither under a door. I've done a lot of cleansings, blessings with holy water, and salted. I think this building is just too large, with too many different energies for us to rid it of anything entirely. The best I can do while here is protect the areas I inhabit. My dear listener, I've presented you with numerous encounters with something unknown, and have shared this with the understanding that you most likely don't believe most or any of this. But as you have gone through this journey with me, I want to say this: the paranormal is ubiquitous. What separates us from them is only a veil, not a wall or even a blanket. This veil is something more or less transparent and delicate. It's a sheer substance that is very easily penetrable. There are things you may never see, that you see, and there are voices speaking to you that you may never hear. The world that those who have moved on live in is not our own, and it is rife with the feelings that we try desperately not to feel. There is nothing to change the fact that they're dead or distract them from this. Take heed, as the tangible realm is already full of deeply mean-spirited people who look with contempt upon one another and speak only in opprobrious ways. If these people pass and are to become ghosts, they will not mean you well, and their unkindness will only grow. Have caution with every encounter. While I wish I could dispel these doubts of every non-believer, I don't wish haunts on anyone. I will try to dissuade you from blindly forcing your fingers through the veil. You need not seek it out, dear listener, but if you wait and are quiet in the dark, long hours, it will find you. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. Well done for making it to the end of the video. I sincerely hoped you have enjoyed this person's experience within the realms of the paranormal. This video actually took a really long time to make. I just want to tell this story because it's funny. I received this really long story in 2021, so 3 years ago now. And when it came to producing it, I saw how long it was and thought, oof, this is going to take a while to narrate. So truth be told, it took me a while to actually start it, and in June of 2023, sometime later, I recorded the first hour of the story roughly. And then I got busy with other projects, and honestly, it fell to the back of my mind. And a few days ago, as I was going through past material, I found it and thought, wow, a video I've never published. I better share this with my audience. So I started the edits, and then it ended abruptly, and I was like, oh, that's weird. So I went and found the file and the document and started reading through it and was like, I see why I stopped now. It's 86 pages long. But I'm really glad that we got there. This is why there was no video on Friday. It took a while to finish this. I think it was about 4 and a bit hours raw audio. And I had to record it over several days. That's why you might notice at some points my tone changes, because I record it during different parts of the day. I'm just finishing this up at about 9 a.m. I've been recording this for the last 2 hours, the final part of the story. So yeah, my voice is pretty raw.
Anyway, thank you all so much for listening. Thank you all so much for being here. It truly means the world to me. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.